It's early 235 AD, somewhere near the Rhine, in a muddy military camp outside Mainz. A young Roman emperor named Alexander Severus is standing in his tent, probably going over troop movements, maybe writing letters, maybe just trying to get through another cold morning on the frontier. He has no idea he's about to become one of the most consequential murder victims in ancient history. Within hours he's dead, killed by his own soldiers, killed alongside his mother, who many considered the real power behind the throne. And with that, something breaks. Not just a life, not just a reign, but an entire system of stability that Rome had spent over 200 years building. That single act of violence in a military camp kicks off what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century. 50 years of chaos, dozens of emperors, most of them murdered, overthrown, or dead in battle within months of taking power. The empire nearly splits into 3 competing states. Frontiers collapse. Cities that had stood peacefully for centuries suddenly find themselves building walls for the first time in generations. If you only studied Rome, you'd already have plenty to talk about. But here's where it gets strange. Here's where this stops being just a Roman story and becomes something much bigger, much weirder, and honestly, much harder to explain. Because at almost exactly the same time, thousands of miles away, other empires are falling apart too. In Persia, the old Parthian dynasty, which had ruled for nearly 500 years, is being violently replaced by a new power, the Sassanids, who will soon become Rome's most dangerous enemy. In Central Asia, the Kushan Empire, once a massive trading power stretching from India to the edges of China, starts fragmenting into smaller, weaker pieces. In East Asia, the mighty Han Dynasty, one of the greatest empires in human history, has already collapsed just a few years earlier, plunging China into the brutal, war-torn period known as the Three Kingdoms. And in India, the political map is shifting too, as old powers decline and new regional kingdoms scramble to fill the gaps. 3 continents, multiple unrelated civilizations, all destabilizing within decades of each other. It almost sounds too coordinated to be a coincidence, like something bigger was happening. Some hidden force, some shared cause, some invisible thread connecting Rome to Persia, to China, to India, all pulling at once. So naturally you want to ask, what was it? Climate change? Disease? Some ancient domino effect where one collapse triggered another across the known world? It's a tempting story. It's a dramatic story. And it's exactly the kind of story that gets repeated in documentaries and books without anyone actually stopping to ask, wait, is this true? Or are we just really good at connecting dots that we're never actually touching? That's the real question we're chasing in this video. Not just what happened in 235 AD, but whether it means what people think it means. We're going to walk through each of these regions one at a time. Rome's murder in the mud, Persia's violent new dynasty, the fraying edges of the Kushan world, China tearing itself apart in civil war, India adjusting to a changing balance of power, even Africa, where Rome, Kush, and Aksum were all navigating their own pressures during this same window of time. We'll look at the evidence, the timelines, the environmental data, the economic strain, and we'll ask the hard question historians still argue about today. Is this one interconnected global crisis? Or is it a trick of hindsight, our modern brains forcing a pattern onto events that were actually separate, unrelated, and only look connected because we're staring at them from 2,000 years away? Before we get into it, if you're listening to this while falling asleep, or driving, or just background noise while you work, let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. I love reading those. And if you want to actually support the show, the best way is to follow it on Spotify. Listen there, and if you enjoy it, leave a 5-star review. Links in the description. Now, Let's go back to that tent outside Mainz. So let's slow down for a second, because before we go continent hopping, we need to deal with a problem hiding in plain sight. 235 AD is not a year when the ancient world collectively looked up, checked a calendar, and decided it was time to fall apart. Nobody in Persia was thinking about Rome. Nobody in China had ever heard of either of them. The number itself, 235, is a modern convenience. A pin we stick in a map so we can talk about something that was actually messy, gradual, and spread out over decades on either side. Real political change almost never respects clean boundaries. We like round numbers, we like clear before and after moments. But history doesn't hand those out very often. Alexander Severus dies in early 235, and that date is precise because Roman sources, imperfect as they are, gave us names, places, and reasonably reliable chronology. But the pressures that led to his murder had been building for years. The economic strain, the frontier threats, the resentment in the army, none of that started the morning he died. His death is a marker, a convenient line in the sand historians use to say, "Here, this is where the old system visibly broke." But the cracks were already there. They just hadn't been named yet. That matters, because once you start comparing Rome to Persia, to the Kushans, to Han China, to Indian kingdoms, you have to be honest about what you're actually comparing. These aren't 5 identical stories that happen to share a start date. They're 5 completely different kinds of events, wearing similar-looking costumes. Take Rome. What happened there in the decades around 235 is best described as a collapse of internal political order, not a collapse of the state itself. The empire didn't disappear. Its borders didn't vanish overnight. What broke was the mechanism for choosing legitimate power, the assumption that emperors would rule for years, not months, and that armies would follow the Senate's choice rather than making their own. That's a crisis of governance, a violent, chaotic one, but the empire's institutions, its cities, its legal system, its economy, all of that kept limping along, just under a rotating cast of increasingly desperate rulers. Persia is a different animal entirely. What happened there wasn't a breakdown, it was a takeover. The Parthians didn't fragment into chaos so much as get replaced root and branch by a rival dynasty with a very clear plan and a very different ideology. That's dynastic replacement, a violent changing of the guard, not a system falling apart from the inside. China had already gone through something closer to full-state collapse. The Han dynasty didn't just lose control for a few decades, it disintegrated into competing warlords who eventually formalized their rivalry into the 3 kingdoms. That's not a temporary crisis of leadership. That's the actual end of a centuries-old imperial structure, followed by open civil war lasting generations. The Kushans, meanwhile, weren't collapsing or being overthrown in any single dramatic event. Their empire was decentralizing, slowly losing its grip over distant provinces, regional governors and local rulers quietly becoming more independent until the centre barely mattered anymore. That's not a crisis you can put a date on. It's an erosion, and erosions are notoriously hard to pin to a single year or even a single decade. And India in this period isn't experiencing collapse at all in the way we usually mean it. It's experiencing a shift in the balance of regional power. Older kingdoms declining, just as newer ones are rising to take their place. That's normal political evolution speeding up, not a system in freefall. So already we've got 5 very different phenomena: collapse, civil war, dynastic overthrow, decentralization and gradual realignment, all getting flattened into the same word: crisis. And that flattening is where a lot of the confusion creeps in. It's tempting to look at 5 empires having a rough few decades and assume they must be experiencing the same thing for the same reason. but rough decades come in a lot of different shapes. There's another complication too, one that rarely gets mentioned. These civilizations didn't leave behind the same kind of evidence. Rome gives us detailed, if biased, written histories, inscriptions, coins, letters. China has extraordinarily meticulous court records, dynastic histories written by scholars obsessed with documenting exactly how and why things fell apart. Persia's own records are thinner, filled in mostly through inscriptions, later retellings and outside observers. The Kushans left us almost nothing in their own words, just coins, a few inscriptions, and archaeological fragments we have to interpret without much context. Comparing these civilizations means comparing a well-lit room to a dim hallway to a pitch-black basement, and pretending we're seeing the same thing in all three. So here's the real question we should be asking. Not whether these were identical crises, because they clearly weren't, but whether they were happening under similar pressure. Was something pushing on all of these systems around the same general window of time, even if each empire cracked in its own particular way, for its own particular reasons? That's a much harder, much more interesting question than simply asking if everything fell apart at once. And it's the one we're actually going to spend this video chasing. And in Rome, that question has a face. A young emperor standing at the edge of the Rhine frontier, surrounded by soldiers who no longer believed he understood the world they lived in. His name was Alexander Severus. He had been emperor for 13 years, since he was a teenager. By 235 he was still only in his mid-20s. And that alone tells you something about the strange position he occupied. Alexander technically ruled the largest empire in Europe, North Africa, and the Near East. He commanded legions, appointed governors, issued laws, controlled an enormous tax system. But for most of his reign, the real power around him had belonged to older people, especially his mother, Julia Mamaea, who was so influential that hostile Roman writers portrayed Alexander less as an emperor than as a son who never escaped the family household. That image was unfair in some ways. Roman historians loved turning politically active women into symbols of weakness, but it also captured a real problem. Alexander's government had tried to rule through compromise. It worked with senators. It relied on lawyers, administrators, and court officials. It preferred negotiation to reckless war, in a stable empire that might have looked sensible. In the empire of the 230s, it was starting to look dangerously out of touch, because Rome's frontiers were under pressure. In the east, a new Persian dynasty had appeared, more aggressive and more confident than the Parthian rulers it replaced. Alexander had already led an eastern campaign that produced no clean, glorious victory. Now there were problems on the Rhine. Groups beyond the frontier, probably including the Alemanni, were raiding Roman territory and threatening the border provinces. So Alexander and his mother travelled north, to the great military zone along the Rhine. They established themselves near Mogontiacum, modern Mainz, in Germany, one of the most important Roman bases on the entire frontier. This was not some remote outpost at the end of the world. Mogontiacum was a military nerve centre. Legions were stationed there. Roads ran from it into Gaul and toward the German frontier. Supplies, officers, orders, money, recruits, intelligence, all moved through places like this. And that was exactly where the emperor's authority would come apart. Alexander faced a decision that Roman emperors had faced for centuries: fight a costly war across the Rhine, risking soldiers and money in difficult terrain, or negotiate with the people on the other side. He appears to have chosen negotiation. Ancient accounts say he tried to buy peace, offering payments or subsidies to Germanic leaders rather than launching the kind of campaign his soldiers wanted. Now, from Alexander's perspective, this may not have been cowardice at all. Diplomacy was a standard Roman tool. Rome had always paid allies, subsidized client rulers, and used money to keep threats divided. It was often cheaper than war. An emperor responsible for defending thousands of miles of frontier could not solve every problem by charging forward with a sword. But try explaining that to a frontier army. The men stationed along the Rhine were not sitting in Rome debating fiscal policy. They were living with raids, alarms, marches, brutal winters, and the constant possibility that the people beyond the river might attack their farms, their families, or the communities that supplied them. They wanted decisive action. They wanted victory, loot, promotions, prestige. And perhaps more than anything, they wanted an emperor who looked like one of them. An emperor who could lead from the front and reward the army that kept the empire alive. Instead, they saw Alexander Severus, young, controlled by his mother, at least in the stories they told about him, surrounded by civilian advisors, willing to bargain with enemies they believed should be crushed. That gap between what the emperor thought was rational and what the soldiers believed was honourable became fatal. Among the troops was a commander named Maximinus, later known as Maximinus Thrax, Maximinus the Thracian. The label probably tells us more about Roman stereotypes than about a precise birthplace, but the basic symbolism was powerful. Maximinus was not a polished senatorial aristocrat raised in the old political world of Rome. He came from the military frontier. Ancient writers describe him as physically enormous, though those stories are probably exaggerated, because Roman writers had a habit of turning men they disliked into giants, monsters, or barbarians. Still, he was exactly the kind of figure Alexander was not: a hard soldier, a commander with influence among the ranks, someone who seemed to embody the army's values. The soldiers elevated him, and once they had done that, Alexander's position became almost impossible. In March of 235, near Mogontiacum, troops murdered Alexander Severus and Julia Mamaea. The details are murky, as they often are when ancient authors describe a palace coup from far away. But the essential fact is not in doubt. An emperor and his mother were killed by the soldiers meant to protect them. Maximinus was proclaimed emperor in their place. And just like that, the imperial centre moved. Not physically, not yet. Rome still had its senate, its temples, its courts, its vast population and immense symbolic prestige. But the practical centre of power had shifted toward the army camps. The emperor was no longer, above all, the man recognised by the Senate, sustained by a dynasty, and presented to the world as Rome's chosen ruler. He was increasingly the man the soldiers would obey, or the man they feared, or the man who could pay them. That distinction sounds technical. It wasn't. It changed everything. For generations, Roman emperors had needed military support. No emperor ruled without the army, but there had usually been other sources of legitimacy too: family connections, senatorial approval, adoption into an imperial line, victories, public rituals, the accumulated weight of office. Alexander Severus belonged to the Severan dynasty, however fragile that dynasty had become. He had inherited a system that still claimed to have rules. His murder exposed how weak those rules now were. If soldiers on one frontier could decide that the emperor had failed, proclaim their own commander, and make that decision stick, then every army became a potential election assembly. Every ambitious general became a possible emperor. Every military crisis became a political crisis, and every emperor now had a terrible incentive: stay close to the troops, win victories fast, raise their pay, punish rivals before rivals could act first. This was not because Roman soldiers suddenly became irrational or uniquely disloyal. They were responding to the conditions around them. The empire demanded more and more from its armies. More frontier defence, more rapid campaigning, more expensive equipment. more cash payments. At the same time, soldiers had watched emperors fail, die, get replaced, and break promises. Loyalty in that world was not an abstract virtue, it was a relationship. Protect us, pay us, lead us, win, and if you cannot do those things, someone else will. The elites in Rome saw the same event very differently. To senators and administrators, Maximinus looked like a nightmare, an emperor raised by troops with little connection to Rome's old governing class, represented the possibility that military necessity would swallow civilian government whole. They were not entirely wrong, but they also missed something important. The army was not invading Roman politics from outside. The army had always been part of Roman politics. What changed in 235 was that it no longer needed to pretend otherwise. That is why historians conventionally use this moment as the beginning of the crisis of the 3rd century. Not because everything instantly collapsed when Alexander died. It didn't. The Roman state kept collecting taxes. Cities kept functioning. Trade continued. Governors still governed. People still married, farmed, argued in court, prayed to their gods, and lived ordinary lives beneath the noise of imperial disaster. But the murder near Mainz revealed that the old balancing mechanism had failed. The emperor could no longer reliably stand above the factions competing for power. He had become the prize in their struggle. Over the next decades, Rome would see a succession of emperors, usurpers, civil wars, invasions, breakaway states, financial strain, and military emergencies. Some rulers would last only months, others would die in battle, be murdered by their own men, or vanish into the chaos of competing claims. The empire would survive, but it would survive by changing into something harder, more militarized, more centralized, and far less stable than the world Alexander Severus had inherited. And the first crack came not in the Senate House, not in a palace conspiracy, but on a cold northern frontier near the Rhine, where soldiers decided that Rome's emperor was no longer their emperor. And once that happened, Rome discovered that replacing one emperor was easy. The hard part was making everyone agree that the replacement had the right to rule. Maximinus had been elevated by troops on the Rhine. That gave him real power. He had soldiers. He had military experience. He had the authority that came from being physically present where the danger was. But it also gave him a problem that would haunt nearly every emperor who followed him. The men who made him emperor had proved that emperors could be made, which meant they could also be unmade. Maximinus never went to Rome. He ruled from the military zones, campaigning against peoples beyond the Rhine and Danube, trying to prove that he was exactly what the empire needed: a fighting emperor, a soldier's emperor, a man who could deliver victories. And for a while, that approach worked. His campaigns seemed to have achieved real successes. But victories cost money. Armies had to be paid. Horses had to be fed. Weapons replaced. Roads maintained. Supplies moved across enormous distances. A Roman army was not just a mass of men with swords. It was one of the largest and most expensive organizations on earth. Thousands of soldiers stationed from northern Britain to the Euphrates depended on grain, fodder, clothing, metal, animals, wagons, engineers, doctors, officers, merchants, tax collectors, and local communities forced to supply all of it. The emperor had to keep that machine running, and he had to keep the men inside it loyal. That meant cash, donatives, special payments to soldiers had been part of Roman political life for a long time. Emperors gave money after victories, accessions, anniversaries, and moments of danger. But after 235, the logic became harsher. A new emperor could not simply claim legitimacy. He had to demonstrate it. Fast. And one of the clearest demonstrations was a payment to the army. The trouble was, money given to one army created expectations in another. raise pay for troops on the Rhine and soldiers on the Danube notice. Reward the guards near the emperor, and frontier legions ask why they are risking their lives for less. Pay a donative to secure the throne, and the next claimant learns the lesson. Soldiers can be persuaded, but persuasion is expensive. So Maximinus taxed heavily. Ancient sources, mostly hostile to him, describe his administration as brutal and grasping. We should be cautious with that language. Senatorial writers had every reason to hate a military emperor who ignored Rome's old elite. But behind their hostility was a real political fact. The government needed resources, and extracting those resources created enemies. In 238, the resistance exploded. It began in North Africa, in the wealthy province around Carthage, where local unrest escalated into a revolt against Maximinus's officials. The rebels turned to an elderly senator named Gordian and proclaimed him emperor. Then they proclaimed his son, also Gordian, co-emperor beside him. It was a dramatic move, but it was not a carefully prepared revolution. The younger Gordian was defeated by forces loyal to Maximinus. He died in battle. His father, overwhelmed by the disaster, killed himself. Their reign had lasted only weeks. Think about what that meant. Rome now had an emperor on the frontier, a rival emperor in Africa, provincial armies taking sides, senators in Rome trying to calculate who would survive, and everyone making decisions with incomplete information. Messages travelled slowly, rumours travelled faster. A commander might be declared emperor hundreds of miles away before the current emperor even knew there was a rebellion. The Senate in Rome, having backed the Gordians, could not simply apologise to Maximinus and hope for mercy. So it chose two new emperors, Pupienus and Balbinus. This was supposed to be a solution. Two experienced senators sharing power, supported by the Senate and by the city of Rome. Instead, it revealed just how many competing centres of power the empire now contained. The Senate had its authority. The people of Rome had their anger. The Praetorian Guard had weapons and its own interests. The frontier armies had their commanders. Provincial elites had wealth and local influence. And none of these groups automatically trusted the others. Maximinus marched south toward Italy. But before he could reach Rome, his own troops killed him outside the city of Aquileia. They had endured a difficult siege, shortages, disease, and a campaign that was no longer delivering easy rewards. His death ended one threat. It did not restore stability. Pupienus and Balbinus were soon murdered by the Praetorian Guard. The guards then elevated the teenage Gordian III, grandson of the first Gordian. In a single year, Rome had seen Maximinus, Gordian I, Gordian III, Pupienus, Balbinus, and Gordian III. Some had ruled for months, some for days. Some had barely had time to issue orders before they were dead. This was not normal succession, it was a systemic warning. Because an empire that depends on personal military command has a built-in weakness. Its armies need commanders who are competent, confident, visible, and successful. But those are exactly the qualities that make a commander politically dangerous. A general who wins victories gains loyal soldiers. A general with loyal soldiers becomes a potential emperor. And an emperor who fears successful generals may remove them, divide their commands, or keep them under suspicion. That makes political sense. It can make military sense impossible. Rome had created an empire too large to defend without powerful commanders. But it had also created a political system in which powerful commanders could destroy the emperor. And the emperor himself could not be everywhere. He might be needed on the Rhine while Persia threatened Syria. He might be campaigning on the Danube while a governor in Africa rebelled. If he left one frontier, another could weaken. If he delegated authority, his delegate might become a rival. If he raised taxes to fund the armies, provinces might revolt. If he failed to raise taxes, soldiers might revolt. There was no simple answer. That is why it is misleading to imagine the 3rd century crisis as a parade of bad rulers making foolish mistakes. Some emperors were incompetent, some were reckless. Some were killed because they lost battles or mishandled politics. But many were trapped by conditions that made success temporary and failure fatal. Civil war made every other problem worse. When Roman armies fought Roman armies, men died who were supposed to be guarding borders. Supplies went to campaigns against fellow citizens instead of frontier defence. Cities and provinces were pressured to provide taxes, grain, transport animals, and recruits for rival claimants. Commanders pulled troops away from exposed regions because securing the throne seemed more urgent than defending a distant river crossing. And from the perspective of a farmer in Gaul, a merchant in Asia Minor, or a landowner in North Africa, it may not have mattered much whether the soldiers arriving at the gate called themselves loyalists or rebels. They still needed food. They still demanded transport. They still took animals, labour, and money. The empire's institutions remained alive, but they were being forced to serve a permanent emergency. This did not mean Rome was finished, far from it. The state still possessed extraordinary reserves. It had trained administrators, tax systems, fortified cities, imperial workshops, law courts, roads, ports, and generations of experience governing a vast and diverse population. Even during the worst years, Roman coins were minted, official documents were issued, trade crossed the Mediterranean, and provincial communities continued their ordinary routines. But the character of the empire was changing. The old confidence that one emperor could stand above the military, the Senate, the provinces, and the court was fading. Power was becoming more openly dependent on armed force. Loyalty was becoming more conditional. Government was becoming more expensive because insecurity itself was expensive. And nowhere was that cost clearer than on the frontiers. Because while Rome's generals competed to control the empire, the people beyond Rome's borders did not pause to wait for the winner. On the Rhine and Danube, that reality was becoming impossible to ignore. For centuries, Roman writers had imagined these rivers as borders, lines between the ordered world of the empire and the peoples beyond it. Forts stood at crossings. Watchtowers overlooked the water. Roads linked military bases, legionary camps anchored whole frontier regions. Rome had not sealed these borders completely, of course. No ancient empire could. Traders crossed them. Diplomats crossed them. Recruits crossed them. Entire communities lived on both sides and dealt with each other constantly. But the system worked because Rome could usually control the terms. It could decide which groups were allowed to settle near the frontier. It could pay subsidies to useful leaders. It could recruit warriors into auxiliary units. It could punish raiders with overwhelming force, and when negotiations failed, a Roman emperor could appear with legions, engineers, cavalry, artillery, supply trains, and enough money to make resistance seem like a bad idea. By the middle of the 3rd century, that balance was becoming harder to maintain. The danger did not come from one single barbarian nation suddenly waking up and deciding to destroy Rome. That is the old story, the simple story, and it is misleading. The people beyond the Rhine and Danube were not unified blocks. They were communities with different languages, customs, leaders, rivalries, and ambitions. Some fought Rome, some traded with Rome, some served Rome. Some wanted Roman land, some wanted Roman goods, some probably wanted nothing more dramatic than cattle, security, and a chance to survive a bad season. But larger confederations were beginning to emerge from this shifting world. Along the Upper Rhine, Roman sources increasingly speak of the Alemanni. The name probably did not describe one ancient people with a single king and a fixed homeland. It seems to have been a label for a gathering of groups, alliances forming and dissolving beyond Rome's frontier. A successful war leader could attract followers, a defeated group could join another. Families displaced by conflict might move toward richer land. What Rome saw as an Alemannic attack may have involved several communities acting together for a particular opportunity. Farther north, near the lower Rhine, the Franks appear in Roman sources. Again, not a nation in the modern sense, more like a coalition, a name that could gather different groups under a shared political and military identity. Some Frankish fighters raided Roman territory, others entered Roman service. Later generations would remember the Franks as founders of kingdoms. But in the 3rd century, they were still part of a much more fluid frontier world, testing what Rome could resist and what Rome could no longer control. And along the Danube and Black Sea, other movements were taking shape. The Goths, as Roman authors called them, had become a major force north of the Black Sea. But even here, the name can hide as much as it reveals. There were different Gothic groups, different leaders, and different relationships with Rome. Some may have come from populations moving gradually southward through Eastern Europe. Some were local communities drawn into new alliances. Some had experience fighting beside or against Rome. By the 240s and 250s, these confederations would launch raids across the Danube, strike into the Balkans, and even take to the sea. That last part mattered. The Black Sea had once been almost a Roman lake. Its coastal cities were connected by trade and imperial administration. But raiders who could seize ships, force local sailors to cooperate, or learn the routes themselves could suddenly threaten places that had not expected an attack. A frontier was no longer just a river line. It was a network of roads, coasts, markets, and weakly defended towns. And every sign of Roman confusion made these opportunities more tempting. Picture a community beyond the Rhine. You know that Roman soldiers are formidable. You have seen their forts. You may have traded with their merchants. You may even have relatives serving in their army. But you also hear news. The emperor has been murdered. Another emperor has been proclaimed. Legions are marching south, not north. Garrisons have been stripped to support a civil war. Tax demands inside the empire are rising. Provincial officials are distracted. A raid that would once have brought swift retaliation might now find empty roads, divided commanders, and a government too busy fighting itself to respond. Under those conditions, raiding was not necessarily an attempt to conquer Rome. Often it was something more immediate. Take livestock, seize captives, capture portable wealth, force a payment, demonstrate that a local leader can provide for his followers. Then withdraw before a large Roman force can arrive. But repeated raids could have effects far beyond the value of what was stolen. Farmers near the frontier might abandon exposed fields. Villages might move closer to walls or fortified towns. Merchants could avoid dangerous roads. Local landowners might invest less in estates that could be burned next season. The state lost tax revenue precisely when it needed more money for troops. Then it demanded more from the communities still able to pay. That created resentment, evasion, and further economic strain. In other words, frontier insecurity could feed the same cycle already consuming Roman politics. The empire needed armies to stop raids, but it needed money to maintain armies. It needed political stability to collect money. Yet the same military commanders entrusted with defending the frontier might be pulled into a struggle for the throne. A general who concentrated troops for a campaign could be accused of preparing a rebellion. A governor who lost a battle might be removed before he could recover. A commander who won too brilliantly might become dangerous for the opposite reason. Rome's enemies did not need to defeat the empire in one great battle. They only needed to make the system spend more than it could comfortably afford, and diplomacy, which had long been one of Rome's strongest weapons, became more complicated too. Roman officials could offer payments, trading privileges, hostages, titles, and military service to leaders beyond the frontier. They could turn one group against another. They could settle outsiders on imperial land in return for military obligations. These methods were not signs of weakness by themselves. Rome had used them for centuries. An empire this large could not survive by fighting everyone all the time. But diplomacy depended on credibility. A payment worked if Rome could keep paying. A treaty worked if Rome could enforce it. A client leader remained useful if he believed Roman support would continue. During civil war, those assumptions weakened. Why honour an agreement made with an emperor who might be dead in 6 months? Why accept Roman gold if another claimant might offer more? Why stay loyal to a distant governor when your own followers believed the frontier was open for plunder? The frontier was not collapsing everywhere at once. That distinction matters. Roman fortifications remained formidable. Many garrisons continued to function. The empire still launched punitive expeditions and still won victories. Maximinus himself had campaigned aggressively beyond the Rhine and Danube, and his reputation as a soldier was built on real military action. But success was becoming harder to convert into security. A campaign could scatter one coalition, only for a new one to form after the army left. A victory could bring captives and prestige, but not solve the political crisis in Rome. An emperor could spend a summer on the Danube, then receive news that a rival had been proclaimed in Africa, Italy, Syria, or Gaul. He would have to leave before the frontier system had time to recover. And that was the crucial weakness. Rome was not facing pressure from an empty wilderness. It was dealing with mobile, adaptive societies that understood Roman wealth, Roman divisions, and Roman military habits. Some frontier groups were becoming larger and better organized, partly because contact with Rome gave them reasons to organize. Roman trade brought wealth. Roman service brought weapons and experience. Roman civil wars created openings. The empire was, in a sense, helping create the more formidable frontier world it now had to contain. Still, as serious as the Rhine and Danube crisis was, there was another frontier that posed a different order of danger. Northern raiders could devastate provinces, expose weak defences, and force Rome into endless, expensive campaigns. But they were usually divided, mobile, and constrained by the difficulty of sustaining long operations deep inside imperial territory. In the east, Rome faced something far more dangerous. Not a loose confederation of shifting groups. Not a raid that might vanish back across a river. But a newly energized state, ruled by an ambitious dynasty, commanding cities, cavalry, wealth, and an imperial ideology of its own. While Rome struggled to decide who its emperor was, Persia was beginning to decide what kind of empire it intended to become. The Parthian Empire had been Rome's eastern rival for nearly 3 centuries. It was the power that had destroyed Crassus at Carrhae, the power that had fought Augustus, Trajan, Marcus Aurelius, and Septimius Severus. A kingdom of great cavalry armies, rich Mesopotamian cities, noble families, caravan routes, and royal courts that could make or unmake rulers across the Iranian plateau. But the Parthian state had a weakness built into its success. It was not governed like Rome. The Arsacid kings ruled through a network of powerful aristocratic houses, regional dynasts, client kings, and local traditions. That system could be flexible. It allowed a vast and diverse empire to function without a huge centralized bureaucracy. Local elites kept their privileges. Great families supplied armies. Distant regions could be governed without the king needing to control every village, tax collector, or fortress personally. But flexibility could also become fragmentation. A Parthian king was powerful when the great families supported him. When they did not, he could face rivals from his own dynasty, rebellions in the provinces, and noblemen whose armies were almost private kingdoms. Rome had seen this repeatedly. A Parthian civil war could suddenly transform the eastern frontier. One claimant might ask Rome for help. Another might offer concessions. A Roman emperor could march into Mesopotamia, seize Ctesiphon, declare victory, and then discover that conquering a city was much easier than imposing lasting control over the whole Iranian world. By the early 3rd century, that old Parthian system was under pressure from within. In the province of Persis, in southwestern Iran, a local ruler named Ardashir was building something new. Persis was no insignificant backwater. It was the old Persian heartland, the land associated with the Achaemenid kings who had once ruled from Egypt to Central Asia. Ardashir's father, Papak, had risen to power there. Ardashir inherited not an empire, but a regional base. Fortresses, cities, loyal followers, and access to the prestige of ancient Persian kingship. Then he started expanding. During the 2020s, Ardashir defeated neighbouring rulers and absorbed their territories one by one. The details are difficult to reconstruct. Much of what survives comes from later traditions, royal inscriptions, coins, and hostile or distant accounts. Ancient sources often turn the rise of a dynasty into a clean, heroic story. Reality was probably messier. Alliances shifted. Local elites calculated their chances. Some resisted, some changed sides when it became clear that Ardashir was winning. But the broad outline is clear enough. Ardashir challenged the Arsacid king Artabanus IV. Their struggle ended in a major battle at Hormozd-Gan, usually dated to 224 AD. Artabanus was killed. That did not mean every Parthian nobleman immediately surrendered, or that the old order vanished overnight. Dynasties do not disappear like a lamp being switched off. Arsacid resistance continued in places. Powerful families still mattered. Local rulers still had to be persuaded, defeated, or incorporated. But after Hormozd-Gan, the direction of power had changed. By the middle of the 220s, Ardashir had emerged as king of kings. The Arsacid dynasty, which had dominated the Near East for generations, was finished as an imperial power. So the Parthian fall belongs close to the year 235, but not exactly to it. The decisive overthrow had happened roughly a decade earlier. What 235 marks is not the instant Persia changed dynasties. It marks the moment Rome's own political crisis collided with the consequences of that change. And those consequences were enormous. Ardashir was not simply another local warlord who had seized a throne. He presented his rule as a restoration of proper imperial order. His titles were grand. On coins and inscriptions, he was Shahanshah, King of Kings. He associated his authority with divine favour and with the Iranian sacred order. Later Sasanian tradition would connect the dynasty to the ancient Achaemenids, the rulers remembered in Greek and Roman history as the great kings of Persia. That connection should be handled carefully. The Sasanians did not possess a modern historian's map of the Achaemenid Empire. They were not reading detailed archives and following a precise blueprint from 500 years earlier. But they did inherit memories, stories, monuments, royal language, and a powerful idea. Iran had once been the centre of a world empire, and a true Persian king should rule accordingly. That idea mattered because it gave expansion a purpose. The old Arsacid kings had often been first among great noble families. Ardashir's new dynasty aimed for something more centralised, more ceremonial, more ideological. The king was not just a successful aristocrat, he was the chosen guardian of a cosmic and political order. His realm was not merely a collection of territories paying tribute. It was Iran, a land of kingship, religion, and inherited imperial destiny. Of course, ideology alone did not create an empire. Ardashir still needed soldiers. He still depended on local elites. He still had to negotiate with old Parthian families rather than simply erase them. The Sasanians inherited much from the world they replaced: cavalry traditions, administrative practices, aristocratic networks, and the strategic importance of Mesopotamia. This was not a total break with the past. It was a reorganization of the past under a new ruling house. But reorganization could produce real strength. A new dynasty could reward loyal supporters with land and office. It could remove rivals who had become too independent. It could concentrate military resources around a more assertive court. It could present campaigns as sacred duties rather than private struggles between nobles. And it could turn old grievances into a program of restoration. For Rome, that meant the eastern frontier was changing at exactly the wrong time. The Parthians had been dangerous, but they had also been divided. Roman emperors could exploit rival claimants. They could bargain with border kings. They could launch punitive expeditions into Mesopotamia and rely on the difficulty of Parthian coordination. Now, across the Euphrates, a new state was taking shape with fresher legitimacy, greater ambition, and every reason to prove itself through military success. The Near East was no longer a frontier between one old empire and another. It was becoming a contest between two political systems being remade at once. In Rome, emperors were murdered, proclaimed, and challenged by their own armies. In Persia, a conquering dynasty was trying to transform victory into durable authority. Rome's crisis weakened the centre. Ardashir's revolution, at least at first, strengthened one. That does not mean the Sasanians were instantly invincible. Building a new empire created disruption too. Conquered regions had to be secured. Old Parthian nobles had to be managed. Tax systems had to keep functioning. Garrisons had to be supplied. A king who promised restoration risked disappointing everyone who expected rewards. But this was the dangerous side of collapse and replacement. Sometimes an old state falls apart and leaves a vacuum. Sometimes it falls apart and produces a more focused, more ambitious rival. Ardashir had destroyed the Arsacid order. His son would test whether the new Sasanian Empire could challenge Rome itself. His name was Shapur. Shapur inherited a new empire. But more importantly, he inherited a mission. He was probably already sharing power with his father Ardashir by the late 230s. Then, around 240 or 242 AD, Shapur became King of Kings in his own right. The dates are not perfectly clear. Ancient chronologies rarely are, especially when fathers and sons rule together. Inscriptions celebrate victories after the fact, and later writers try to turn messy transitions into neat stories. But the important part is clear enough. Shapur came to the throne at the exact moment Rome was beginning to come apart. Alexander Severus had been murdered on the Rhine. Maximinus Thrax had been proclaimed by the army. Roman soldiers were fighting Roman soldiers. Provincial governors were watching the centre with growing doubt. And far to the east, the new Sasanian king looked across the Euphrates at territories that had been fought over for centuries. This was not some remote desert border where a few forts exchanged arrows. The Roman-Persian frontier ran through some of the richest and most strategically important land in the ancient world. Mesopotamia was a web of rivers, irrigated fields, caravan cities, military roads, and fortified crossings. Whoever controlled it could tax trade between the Mediterranean, Iran, Central Asia, Arabia, and India. Whoever lost it exposed Syria, Anatolia, and the Levant to attack. and Mesopotamia had never been settled. Rome had pushed east under Trajan, then pulled back. Septimius Severus had captured Ctesiphon, the old Parthian capital, then organized parts of northern Mesopotamia into Roman provinces. Cities like Nisibis, Carrhae, Edessa, Dura Aeropos, and Hatra became pieces on a massive imperial chessboard. Some were Roman, some were Parthian, some were client kingdoms trying to survive between powers far larger than themselves. Every fortress mattered. Every river crossing mattered. Every local ruler mattered. For Shapur, this was not merely an opportunity for plunder. The Sasanians had replaced the Parthians partly by claiming to restore Iranian greatness. That claim created pressure. A king of kings who promised renewal had to show that Iran was no longer divided and defensive. He had to reward nobles, satisfy cavalry commanders, secure vulnerable frontiers, and demonstrate that the new dynasty could succeed where the old one had failed. And the most obvious place to prove it was against Rome. The early fighting was brutal and confused. Roman sources and Persian sources tell the story differently, which is exactly what you would expect when both empires needed victories. Shapur's own great inscription at Naqsh-i-Rustam, carved into the Iranian landscape beside the monuments of earlier kings, lists cities and territories taken from the Romans. Roman historians, meanwhile, preserve their own versions of campaigns, defeats, and recoveries. Neither side gives us a neutral battlefield report, but there is no doubt about the scale of the contest. In the 240s, Sasanian forces moved into Roman Mesopotamia and Syria. Hatra, the heavily fortified desert city that had resisted Roman and Parthian pressure for generations, fell to Shapur. Its destruction was a warning. Hatra had been more than a city. It had been a buffer, a trading centre, and a military obstacle sitting between the great empires. Once it was gone, the shape of the frontier changed. Then Shapur faced the young Roman emperor, Gordian III. Gordian was still barely more than a teenager when he marched east. But Rome needed an eastern victory desperately. A successful campaign could do more than recover territory. It could prove that the empire still had a functioning government, still had generals capable of commanding loyalty, still had the wealth to move armies across hundreds of miles, and still had an emperor worthy of obedience. That is what made war with Persia so dangerous for Rome. A defeat on the Rhine was terrible. It could mean raiding, lost territory, frightened provinces, and demands for more soldiers. But a defeat in the east threatened something even larger. It threatened the empire's prestige. Rome had ruled the Mediterranean world partly through force, but also through reputation. Provincial communities, client kings, merchants, soldiers and elites needed to believe that Roman power would eventually arrive, that Roman armies could win, and that an emperor could protect those who served him. If Persia could take cities in Mesopotamia, if it could threaten Syria, if it could defeat emperors in open war, then that belief began to crack. Gordian's campaign initially achieved successes. Roman armies pushed into Mesopotamia, and one battle near Rosina appears to have gone badly for the Persians. But the war did not end there. Roman forces continued south toward the Sasanian heartland. Then, near Mizich in 244 AD, something went wrong. Persian sources claimed a great victory. Roman accounts are less clear, and Gordian's death soon afterward became tangled in political accusation. Was he killed in battle? Did he die from wounds? Was he murdered by Philip, the officer who succeeded him? We cannot say with certainty. What matters is that Gordian was dead. Philip became emperor, and Rome made peace with Shapur under conditions the Persian king could present as a triumph. That was a terrible outcome for a state already struggling with military politics. Every eastern campaign consumed men Rome could not easily spare. legions had to be transferred from other frontiers. Cavalry, engineers, supply officers, siege equipment, pack animals, grain shipments, replacement weapons, coin for pay, all of it had to move across an empire whose political centre was becoming less stable by the year. The Euphrates frontier was not distant from Rome's internal crisis. It was plugged directly into it. An emperor who left the Rhine to fight Persia risked rebellion in the west. An emperor who stayed in the west risked humiliation in the east. An emperor who raised taxes to fund both fronts risked alienating cities, landowners and soldiers whose pay was losing value anyway. This was the trap. Rome was still enormous. It still possessed great armies, rich provinces, experienced commanders and immense reserves of prestige. But its commitments were becoming harder to meet all at once. Persia did not cause the Roman crisis by itself. That would be far too simple. But Shapur made the crisis more expensive, more dangerous, and harder to contain. And Mesopotamia was only one part of the problem. To the north lay Armenia, a mountain kingdom caught between Rome and Iran. Armenian kings could become Roman allies, Persian clients or targets for replacement. Control of Armenia meant influence over routes through the highlands and access toward Anatolia and the Caucasus. It also meant denying those advantages to the other empire. A change of ruler in Armenia was never just a local succession. It could be a strategic earthquake. Beyond Armenia, the Caucasus formed another dangerous zone of passes, kingdoms, and competing loyalties. The routes between the Black Sea, the Caspian, the steppe, and the Iranian plateau ran through landscapes that were difficult to conquer but impossible to ignore. Rome needed friendly rulers there to shield its eastern provinces. Persia needed them to protect its northern approaches and project power toward Armenia and Anatolia. So the frontier was not a line, it was a whole contested world. Cities, mountain passes, client kings, caravan routes, fortresses and communities that might switch allegiance if they believed one empire was rising and the other was weakening. Shapur understood this. His wars were not simply raids across a river. They were attempts to reshape the political geography of the Near East, and he was just getting started. In 260 AD, another Roman emperor, Valerian, would march east to confront Shapur. He would not return. Shapur captured him alive, an event so shocking that the Persian king had it carved into stone. A Roman emperor held before the King of Kings, but even before that humiliation, the message was already clear. Rome was not facing the old Parthian rival anymore. It was facing a new Persian monarchy that had discovered the exact pressure point in an overstretched empire. And beyond Shapur's eastern frontier, another imperial world was beginning to fracture too. Beyond Shapur's eastern frontier, another imperial world was beginning to fracture too. The Kushan Empire had once been one of the great connectors of Eurasia. It stretched across a huge and difficult landscape. Central Asia, Bactria, Afghanistan, the mountain routes of the Hindu Kush, Gandhara, and much of northern India. Its rulers controlled cities that sat on the roads between China, Iran, India, and the Roman world. They minted gold coins in astonishing quantities. They patronized Buddhist institutions, Iranian cults, Greek traditions, and Indian religious communities. Their coins could show a ruler in Central Asian dress beside gods, with Greek, Iranian, and Indian names. This was not a small kingdom at the edge of history. The Kushans ruled the corridor, and that corridor mattered because Eurasia was not divided into isolated civilizations. Silk, spices, gemstones, ivory, glassware, textiles, horses, metalwork, religious ideas, artistic styles, and technical knowledge moved through these regions in stages. A merchant leaving northern India did not necessarily travel all the way to Rome. Goods changed hands many times. At every oasis, mountain pass, river crossing, and fortified city, someone took a profit. The Kushan state sat across some of the richest sections of that network. When the Kushans were strong, they could protect roads, tax caravans, support cities, and connect faraway economies that never saw each other directly. But by the middle of the 3rd century, that imperial structure was becoming harder to see. And here we need to be careful. The late history of the Kushan Empire is one of the most difficult chronological problems in ancient Eurasia. We do not have a clean narrative written by court historians explaining exactly when one king died, when another took power, which province rebelled first, or the precise year the empire ended. Even the dates of some Kushan rulers remain debated. Historians reconstruct this world from coins, inscriptions, archaeological layers, scattered references in Chinese, Indian, Iranian, and later sources, and the changing patterns of art and administration. That means we should be suspicious of neat collapse dates. Empires almost never fall on the day a modern timeline says they did, especially empires spread across mountains, deserts, river valleys, and trade cities. Control fades unevenly. One province may still mint coins in the old ruler's name, while another has already accepted a new dynasty. A city can remain prosperous, even as imperial authority disappears. A local governor can become independent without announcing a revolution. Political collapse often looks less like a building exploding and more like a river breaking into smaller channels. That seems to be what happened in the Kushan world. By the 3rd century, the vast empire associated with earlier rulers like Kanishka was no longer operating as one unquestioned power across its former range. Its western territories, especially Bactria and regions around the Hindu Kush, came under increasing pressure from the new Sasanian monarchy. Shapur and his successors were not content to rule only the Iranian plateau and Mesopotamia. The Sasanian claimed to be king of kings pointed east as well as west. For a dynasty trying to replace the Parthians, Central Asia was too important to ignore. Bactria was not some empty frontier. It was a wealthy region of irrigated agriculture, old cities, cavalry traditions, and routes leading toward the steppe, China, and India. Whoever controlled it gained revenue, military manpower, and access to the trade roads that ran through the mountains, and it stood directly beside lands that had long been part of the Kushan sphere. So while Shapur pressed Rome in Mesopotamia, Sasanian influence was also expanding eastward. In some regions, Kushan authority appears to have been replaced or overshadowed by rulers we now call the Kushano-Sasanians. Their very name tells the story. They were connected to the Sasanian imperial system, but they ruled former Kushan territories using local political forms and, in some cases, Kushan-style coinage. This was not necessarily a simple conquest where one army arrived, one king surrendered, and an entire civilization changed flags overnight. It was more complicated than that. The Sasanians needed local elites. They needed people who knew the roads, controlled the irrigated land, recruited soldiers, spoke regional languages, and had influence in cities where imperial authority had always depended on negotiation. A Persian prince or official could claim power in Bactria. But to actually rule it, he had to work through the political world the Kushans had built. That is why the evidence looks mixed. Old symbols remain. New titles appear. Coin designs change gradually. Local traditions continue, but the balance of power shifts, and every shift had consequences. A weaker Kushan center meant that the great corridor between India, Iran, and Central Asia was no longer governed through a single dominant imperial framework. Regional rulers had more room to maneuver. Cities and frontier communities had to make new calculations. Which authority could protect a caravan? Which king could secure a mountain pass? Which coin would be accepted in the next market? Which army would arrive if a rival seized the road? These questions were not abstract. Trade depends on trust. A merchant can survive high prices, he can survive taxes. What he cannot easily survive is uncertainty. If a route becomes dangerous, if every district has a different ruler, if soldiers demand payment at every crossing, if a war closes one pass and bandits threaten another, commerce does not necessarily stop. But it changes. Goods move by different routes. Profits shrink. Some cities decline. Others rise because they now sit on the safer road. That is how political fragmentation remakes an economy without destroying it. And this is why the Kushan decline matters to the larger story of 235 AD. Rome was struggling to hold together its frontiers. The Sasanians were building a more aggressive Iranian empire. The Kushan political order was weakening across the lands beyond Iran. None of these developments need to have been caused by one single event. There was no message sent across 3 continents announcing that every empire should collapse at once. But they were connected by geography, trade, war, and opportunity. When Persia grew stronger, Kushan rulers faced a harder western frontier. When Kushan authority weakened, the balance of power across Central Asia changed. And when the corridors of Central Asia changed, the effects could travel outward, toward India, toward China, toward Iran, and eventually toward the Mediterranean world. Because Central Asia was never a blank space between civilizations. It was the corridor through which civilizations discovered that the crisis next door could become their problem too. But calling Central Asia a corridor can be misleading. A corridor sounds empty, a place you move through on the way to somewhere more important. A hallway between the real rooms. Central Asia was never that. It was full of cities, farms, fortresses, markets, temples, and competing rulers. It was a world shaped by deserts, but not defined by emptiness. Between the great barriers of the Karakum, Kizilkum, Taklamakan, Pamirs, Hindu Kush, and Tian Shan, rivers created islands of life. The Amu Darya, the Sir Darya, the Zarafshan, smaller streams flowing down from snow-covered mountains. Where water could be controlled, people built oasis cities. And where cities existed, roads converged. Places like Merv, Balkh, Samarkand, Bukhara, Temez, Khotan, Kashgar, and the settlements of Sogdia were not just stopping points for exhausted caravans. They were economic engines. An oasis could grow grain, grapes, fruit, cotton, and fodder for animals. Its workshops could produce textiles, metal goods, ceramics, leather, dyes, and luxury objects. Its merchants could finance journeys that took months or years. Its rulers could tax every camel train entering the gates. Its garrison could decide whether a road was safe, whether a rival caravan was searched, whether a foreign ambassador passed through, or whether an invading army found water. Control an oasis, and you did not merely control a city. You controlled a lifeline. This is the basic reality behind the Silk Road. Not one road, despite the name. Not even one continuous trade system managed from a single imperial capital. It was a shifting web of routes. Some crossed the deserts from one oasis to another. Some ran north through the steppe. Some passed through narrow valleys in the Pamirs or climbed toward the Hindu Kush. Others carried goods down into India or west toward Iran and Mesopotamia. And every route depended on local people. A Roman senator buying silk in Italy probably imagined it had come from a distant Eastern empire. But silk did not travel across Eurasia in one merchant's hands. It might leave China as thread or cloth, move through the Tarim basin, be exchanged in Sogdian cities, carried by Iranian merchants, taxed at a frontier post, repackaged in Mesopotamia, and sold again at a Syrian port. By the time it reached Rome, dozens of people may have taken a share. The same was true in reverse. Glassware, silver vessels, coral, wine, wool textiles and coins moved eastward in stages. Indian spices, ivory, aromatics, gemstones and cotton moved north and west. Horses from the steppe could be traded into Chinese armies. Buddhist monks carried texts and ideas through the mountain passes. Artistic styles crossed borders so often that a temple in one region could combine Indian religious images, Iranian symbols, Greek artistic techniques, and Central Asian patronage. This was not globalization in the modern sense. Most people never travelled far from home. Most villages remained local, but the networks were real, and in the 3rd century they were becoming politically unstable. That instability did not begin with emperors alone. Central Asia was home to local dynasts who ruled valleys, towns, and fortified districts. Merchant families built wealth and influence across generations. Nomadic and semi-nomadic groups controlled grazing lands, supplied horses, escorted caravans, raided weak settlements, and served as soldiers for settled states. Garrison commanders held forts at river crossings and mountain mouths. Religious institutions owned land, received donations, and connected communities across long distances. No distant emperor could simply point at a map and command this landscape. A king in Ctesiphon, Peshawar, Luoyang, or later Nanjing could claim sovereignty over Central Asia. But that claim only mattered if local rulers accepted it, if tax collectors could reach the markets, if soldiers could be paid, if forts were supplied, and if caravans believed the state could protect them. When imperial authority was strong, this arrangement could be profitable for everyone involved. The empire gained customs duties, tribute, prestige, intelligence, horses, recruits, and access to luxury goods. Local elites gained protection, titles, coinage, and a powerful ally against rivals. Merchants gained predictable rules, not low taxes necessarily. Ancient states loved taxes, but predictable taxes. A caravan master could calculate a toll. He could build it into the price. What he feared was meeting 3 new rulers in 300 miles, each demanding payment and none capable of keeping the road open. And that was exactly the danger when larger powers began to weaken. The fragmentation of Kushan authority did not turn Central Asia into chaos overnight. Some cities continued to thrive. Trade found detours. Merchants are practical people. If one pass closes, they look for another. If one ruler becomes too expensive, they cultivate relations with his rival. If a war makes the southern route dangerous, goods may shift north through the steppe or east through the Tarim Basin. But every detour had a cost. Longer routes meant more animals, more guards, more food, more time, and greater risk. A city that once sat at the centre of a major road could lose traffic. Another city, previously peripheral, might suddenly become important because its ruler offered security or lower tolls. The movement of trade could rearrange wealth across an entire region, and military power moved through the same corridors. The roads that carried silk also carried scouts, refugees, envoys, deserters, mercenaries and armies. A Sasanian advance into former Kushan territories was not only a change in court politics. It brought new garrisons, new officials, new demands for supplies, and new pressure on communities already balancing between local rulers and distant empires. A mountain pass that mattered to a merchant carrying gemstones also mattered to a cavalry force trying to reach Bactria or Gandhara before winter. This is why Central Asia could reveal imperial weakness so quickly. At the centre of an empire, weakness can be hidden for a while. A ruler can still issue coins. Officials can still perform ceremonies. A capital can still look magnificent, even when the treasury is strained and the army is divided. But at the edges, the truth becomes harder to conceal. A fort goes unpaid. A governor stops sending revenue. A local dynasty puts its own name on coins. A caravan hires private guards because the imperial garrison cannot protect the road. Nomadic groups discover that border defences are thinner than they used to be. Merchants begin accepting a different ruler's currency. None of these acts needs to look dramatic on its own. Together, they tell you that power is moving, and Central Asia was where that movement could spread in multiple directions at once. Pressure from the Sasanians could push into Bactria and Afghanistan. Weakness in the Kushan sphere could open opportunities for regional rulers in northern India. Changes along the oasis routes could alter the flow of goods toward China. Steppe groups could exploit a weakened frontier, then become allies, enemies, or founders of new states. The corridor did not simply transmit trade. It transmitted instability. That does not mean every crisis across Eurasia was caused by a disruption in Central Asia. History is rarely that neat. Rome had its own civil wars. Persia had its own dynastic revolution. China had already endured the collapse of the Han. India was developing its own regional political landscape. But Central Asia made isolation impossible. It was the place where distant empires brushed against each other without always knowing it, where a change in one kingdom's tax system could affect a merchant network hundreds of miles away, where the fall of a garrison could alter the choices of nomads, traders, and local kings, where the disappearance of one imperial centre did not create a void, but a dangerous competition to replace it. And to the east, beyond the deserts and mountain gates, another great imperial order had already broken apart. China's Han dynasty had fallen years before 235. Its collapse would show just how expensive it was when a civilization built for unity had to survive an age of permanent war. China's crisis did not begin in 235. By that year, the great Han dynasty had already been dead for 15 years. That matters, because it is tempting to line up the map of the ancient world and look for one perfect moment when every empire fell together. Rome entering crisis in the 230s. Persia transformed by a new dynasty. Kushan authority fragmenting. Frontiers becoming less secure from the Mediterranean to Central Asia. Then you look east and ask, what happened to China in 235? The answer is complicated. China did not experience the exact same kind of sudden breakdown at the exact same time. Its imperial order had cracked earlier, through decades of rebellion, court conflict, famine, warlordism, and military mobilization. By 235, the Han was not collapsing. China was living with the consequences. For almost 4 centuries, the Han dynasty had provided something extraordinary, a political framework capable of ruling much of the Chinese heartland. It built roads, maintained granaries, appointed officials, collected taxes, organized armies, and linked distant regions to an imperial center. Not perfectly. No empire works perfectly. But for generations the Han gave elites, farmers, merchants and frontier commanders a basic assumption that the world had a centre. That centre was the emperor. By the late 2nd century, that assumption was breaking down. The problems had been building for years. Powerful landholding families accumulated influence in the provinces. Court factions fought for control around child emperors. Eunuchs inside the palace competed with scholar officials outside it. Tax burdens, local corruption, debt and land concentration created anger in the countryside. Floods and harvest failures made everything worse. When people are already living close to the edge, a bad harvest is not just an economic statistic. It is hunger, and hunger makes every promise of a better world sound dangerous. In 184, that danger exploded in the Yellow Turban Rebellion. Its followers drew on religious ideas, healing movements, and a simple revolutionary message. The Han had lost heaven's favour. A new age was coming. The movement spread across multiple provinces with astonishing speed. The imperial government eventually crushed the main uprising, but victory came at a terrible cost. To defeat rebellion, the Han relied more heavily on regional commanders, local strongmen, private armies, and emergency military powers. That was the beginning of the trap. An empire can survive unrest if its central government remains stronger than the people it empowers to suppress it. But the Han increasingly gave military authority to men who had their own troops, their own clients, their own tax bases, and their own ambitions. Once those men discovered the centre was weak, they stopped acting like servants. They started acting like rulers. The final years of the Han were not one clean civil war with two sides and a clear ending. They were a cascade. Palace coups, assassinations, provincial revolts, armies changing allegiance, cities sacked, fields abandoned, refugees moving away from battle zones, commanders raising troops supposedly to restore order, then using those troops to seize territory for themselves. In 189, the warlord Dong Zhuo marched into the capital, took control of the court, and effectively made the emperor his hostage. Rival commanders formed coalitions against him. The capital region became a battlefield. The old imperial institutions still existed, at least on paper. Emperors were still proclaimed, edicts were still issued, but power had moved elsewhere. It was now wherever an army could be fed. That phrase explains a great deal about China's collapse. Ancient governments were not held together by ideology alone. They needed grain, they needed transport animals, they needed secure roads. They needed officials who could assess taxes and soldiers who could enforce collection. They needed farmers willing, or at least able, to plant next year's crop. Civil war attacks all of those things at once. A village caught between rival armies might lose its harvest to requisitioning, its young men to conscription, its livestock to raiding, and its remaining grain to taxes demanded by two different authorities. If the village survived, its people might flee. If they fled, fields went unplanted. If fields went unplanted, armies had to seize food from somewhere else. And that created more flight, more hunger, more war. It is a vicious cycle. The population figures from this era are difficult. Ancient censuses measured households and taxable people, not necessarily every person alive, and wartime records are especially unreliable. But the broad pattern is clear enough. The late Han world suffered enormous demographic damage. Death, displacement, disease, under-registration, and the collapse of administration all reduced the number of people visible to the state. Entire regions were devastated. Others became militarized zones controlled by local commanders rather than imperial officials. Out of this destruction emerged three rival states. In the north, Cao Cao built the strongest power base. He was not simply a warlord with a sword and a horse. He was an organizer. He restored agriculture in war-damaged regions, settled displaced people, recruited soldiers, and used agricultural military colonies to feed his armies. He controlled the Han Emperor, which gave his actions a legal cover his rivals could not easily ignore. Cao Cao never formally replaced the Han himself, but after his death, his son Cao Pi did. In 220, Cao Pi forced the last Han emperor to abdicate and founded the state of Wei. The Han Dynasty was over. To the southwest, Liu Bei claimed to preserve Han legitimacy and established Shu Han in 221, centered in Sichuan. His claim was political, but it was also emotional. For people who still believed the Han should continue, Shu Han offered the idea that the old order had not completely died. and in the southeast, Sun Quan built a third state around the lower Yangtze region. In 229, he declared himself Emperor of Wu, Wei, Shu Han, Wu, the Three Kingdoms. Later Chinese tradition would turn this age into one of the most famous heroic eras in world history. Brilliant strategists, oath-bound warriors, betrayal, loyalty, impossible battles, and last stands. Much of that image comes from later storytelling, especially the romance of the Three Kingdoms. The real period was dramatic enough without embellishment. It was also brutal. These were not three peaceful successor states dividing an inheritance and agreeing to coexist. They were heavily armed regimes born from the wreckage of a universal empire. Each claimed some version of legitimate rule. Each maintained large military forces. Each needed grain, labour, horses, fortifications, transport networks, and loyal commanders. And each knew that the division of China might not last forever. By 235, Wei held the demographic and agricultural core of the north. Wu controlled the wealthy riverlands of the southeast. Shu Han held the defensible but limited southwest. None was strong enough to reunify the entire former Han realm quickly. None was weak enough to be ignored. So China was not outside the wider 3rd century story. It was an earlier chapter of it. Rome's political crisis became unmistakable after 235. China's great imperial fracture had begun decades before, and by 235 it had hardened into a landscape of rival courts and permanent war. The chronology does not match exactly. We should not force it to. China was not a delayed copy of Rome, and Rome was not a Western version of the Han collapse. But the comparison is still revealing. Across Eurasia, enormous states were discovering the same hard truth. Imperial unity depended on more than a famous dynasty, a sacred ruler, or a powerful capital. It depended on whether the state could feed armies, manage frontiers, control ambitious commanders, protect farming communities, and make people believe that obedience was safer than rebellion. When that system failed, the empire did not simply disappear. It broke into armed pieces, and in China, those pieces were about to spend generations fighting over who would put the world back together. This was the cost of the Three Kingdoms, not one final battle, not one decisive year when the map suddenly changed. It was the cost of having three states that all believed they had a claim to the same empire, all prepared for war, and all trapped in a rivalry they could not afford to end. Wei, Shu, and Wu were not just armies facing each other across a few contested provinces. They were full political systems built for survival. They taxed farmers, they registered households, they appointed officials, they repaired canals, they stored grain, they moved conscripts. They watched the frontiers, and beneath all the speeches about legitimacy and restoring order, each government faced the same brutally practical question. How do you keep an army in the field next year? For Wei, the answer began with the north. Wei controlled the old Han heartland, broad agricultural plains, major population centres, and much of the territory that had historically supplied Chinese empires with grain, taxes, recruits, and horses. It was the largest of the three states by population and resources. But size did not make its position easy. The northern plains were exposed. Wei had to defend against threats along its northern and western frontiers, while also keeping huge forces ready for war against Shu and Wu. It needed frontier garrisons, it needed cavalry, it needed fortified cities and secure supply lines. And it needed a bureaucracy capable of turning harvests into military power. That is why the agricultural colonies developed under Cao Cao mattered so much. Known as Tuntian, these settlements placed soldiers, displaced people, and farming families on land where they could produce grain under state supervision. The system did not magically repair a devastated countryside. Nothing could do that quickly. But it gave way a way to rebuild production while feeding the military machine that kept the state alive. In the southwest, Shu Han faced a different reality. Shu was smaller, with fewer people and less farmland than Wei. But it possessed one enormous advantage: geography. Its centre was the Sichuan Basin, a fertile region surrounded by mountains and difficult approaches. Rivers flowed through narrow gorges, roads could be blocked, passes could be defended. An invading army could march towards Shu, but marching in was not the same as conquering it. Every mile deeper into the mountains stretched supply lines and gave defenders more chances to strike. Shu's rulers understood that survival depended on turning terrain into strategy. Fortified passes, garrison towns, and control of the routes through the Qinling Mountains were not details on a map. They were the walls of the state, but defensive geography came with a price. A kingdom protected by mountains could also be constrained by them. Moving grain, weapons, and troops out of Sichuan toward Wei's territory was difficult and expensive. Shu's famous northern campaigns, associated above all with the Chancellor Zhuge Liang, were bold attempts to break that strategic trap. They showed that Shu had ambition, organization, and a disciplined state structure. They also showed the limits of those things. An army can win battles and still lose a war if it cannot keep its supply wagons moving. Wu, in the southeast, built power around water. The lower Yangtze region was a world of rivers, lakes, marshes, canals, and fertile rice-growing land. To an invading army unfamiliar with it, this could be a nightmare. Armies trained for the northern plains could not simply march south and expect the same methods to work. Roads disappeared into wetlands. Disease spread in unfamiliar climates. Supply routes depended on boats, and every major river crossing could become a fortress. Wu's strength was not merely that it had the Yangtze River as a defensive barrier. It had shipyards, fleets, river commanders, and local communities accustomed to moving through this watery landscape. The Yangtze was a boundary, a highway, and a weapon all at once. This is one of the things the Three Kingdoms period makes clear. Political fragmentation did not mean administration vanished. China was divided, but it was not reduced to chaos everywhere. Wei still ran a large civil bureaucracy. Shu still appointed officials, collected revenue, and maintained state workshops. Wu still governed major cities, organized transport, and drew wealth from one of the most productive agricultural regions in East Asia. Documents were written, laws were enforced, taxes were assessed, engineers managed water systems, local elites negotiated with courts and commanders. Sophisticated government continued, even while the governments themselves fought for supremacy. If you enjoy these moments where the familiar story of history starts getting much stranger, you can get the channel's book about the 12 unexplained mysteries on the website. The link is in the description. But administration did not make permanent war painless. Every state had to pull resources away from ordinary life and into defense. Farmers paid grain taxes, laborers repaired walls and roads. Families lost sons to conscription, border communities lived with raids, forced relocations, and the possibility that their fields would become a battlefield. Refugees fled from one state to another, carrying skills, labor, and information with them. Governments tried to register these people, settle them, tax them, recruit them. Human beings became a strategic resource, and the war lasted long enough for that logic to shape an entire generation. Shu fell first, conquered by Wei in 263. 2 years later, the Wei dynasty itself was replaced by the Jin, founded by the Sima family. Then in 280, Jin armies crossed the Yangtze and defeated Wu. For the first time since the fall of Han, much of China was reunited. That reunification matters because it complicates the easy story that fragmentation always means the end of civilization. China had broken into rival kingdoms, but the institutions needed to rebuild empire had not disappeared. They had survived inside the competing states. Jin did not create order from nothing. It inherited officials, tax systems, military colonies, regional economies, roads, granaries, and political habits forged during decades of division. Rome offers a useful comparison. Rome, too, would claw its way back from the crisis that began in 235. Emperors such as Aurelian restored much of the empire's territorial unity. Later rulers rebuilt administration, reorganized armies, and stabilized government on a new basis. But Rome's recovery was partial, costly, and never a return to the old world. China's Jin reunification was also real, but fragile. Within a few decades, succession struggles and invasions would tear it apart again. So reunification was not a cure. It was a victory over one crisis, not an escape from history. The Three Kingdoms show us a world fractured but still highly organized. A civilization can be divided into rival states, drained by war and scarred by displacement without losing its administrative memory or its capacity to rebuild. That distinction matters, because in the 3rd century empires were not simply falling off a cliff. Many were changing shape under pressure, surviving in fragments and gathering the resources for whatever came next. The same distinction matters in India. When Kushan power weakened across the north, it can be tempting to imagine an enormous empty space opening up between Persia and China. One empire fades from the sources, its famous gold coins become less common. Its control over long-distance routes becomes harder to trace, and suddenly the map looks blank. But blank maps can be deceptive. Northern India, after the Kushans, was not a void. It was a political landscape being redistributed. At their height, the Kushans had connected an extraordinary range of territories. Their rulers governed from Central Asia into the northwestern subcontinent and the Gangetic Plain. They controlled or influenced the routes that carried silk, horses, spices, gemstones, ivory, metalwork, and religious ideas between India, Iran, Central Asia, and China. Their coins circulated across huge distances. Their courts patronized Buddhist institutions, honored Iranian and Indian deities, and ruled populations speaking many different languages. This was not a small kingdom that disappeared without consequences. It was one of the great connecting powers of its age. But by the 3rd century, that structure was becoming harder to hold together. Pressure came from several directions. In the northwest, the new Sasanian Persian Empire was expanding eastward. Shapur I, the same ruler challenging Rome in the Near East, claimed authority over lands that had once belonged to the Kushan sphere. Persian inscriptions speak of Kushanchas, kings of the Kushans, rulers who seem to have governed parts of the region under Sasanian influence or supervision. That does not mean the Sasanians simply conquered all of northern India in one unstoppable sweep. The evidence is too uneven for that. Control probably varied enormously from one region to another. But it does show that the old Kushan frontier was no longer secure. And when an imperial frontier becomes uncertain, local rulers start making calculations of their own. Some negotiate, some pay tribute, some declare independence. Some continue using the old imperial language and coinage because everybody already recognizes it. Others build new identities around local cities, sacred sites, military followings, or family networks. That is what political change often looks like on the ground. Not an empire vanishing overnight, but authority becoming more local, more contested, and more complicated. In Western India, the Western Kshatrapas remained an important power. Their rulers controlled parts of Gujarat, Malwa, and the Western Deccan, regions tied to ports and inland trade routes. They issued their own coins, maintained courts, and competed with neighbouring powers for revenue and territory in the central Gangetic region and around Mathura. Other dynasties emerged or became more visible, including rulers remembered in inscriptions and coins as the Nagas. Their history is difficult to reconstruct because the surviving evidence is fragmentary. We do not have a neat chronicle explaining every succession, every battle, every border change, but that silence does not mean nothing was happening. It means power was no longer concentrated in one court whose records and coins dominate the archaeological record. Further south in the Deccan, the political picture was different again. The Satavahana kingdom, which had long been a major force in central and southern India, had also fragmented by this period. In its place came regional powers, including the Ikshvakus in the eastern Deccan and, later, the Vakatakas in central India. These were not merely temporary war bands occupying the ruins. They built dynasties, they made grants, they sponsored religious institutions. They raised armies and competed for control of fertile land, trade corridors, and towns. India was not becoming less important, it was becoming less unified. And even that needs to be stated carefully. The subcontinent had never been one single political unit under the Kushans. Their power was strongest in the northwest and north. Beyond their direct reach lay many regions with their own rulers, traditions, economies, and religious centres. What changed after Kushan dominance weakened was not the disappearance of India's political life. It was the balance between large imperial networks and smaller regional states. Trade continued through this transition, although not always in the same form or at the same intensity. Merchants still moved goods across the Indian Ocean. Ports on the western coast still connected the subcontinent to Arabia, the Persian Gulf, East Africa, and the Roman world. Inland routes still linked farming regions, craft centres, monasteries, and market towns. The great long-distance trade of the Kushan age may have faced new risks as Central Asian politics changed, but exchange did not stop because one dynasty lost power. In fact, local rulers had strong reasons to protect it. Customs duties, market taxes, access to luxury goods, and control of roads could all become sources of wealth. A smaller kingdom could not command an entire transcontinental corridor, but it could control a river crossing, a mountain pass, a port, a caravan town, or the fields that fed a city. Religious institutions helped provide continuity too. Buddhist monasteries remained active across many regions. They were not isolated places of prayer. They could own land, receive donations, house travellers, preserve texts, and stand beside trade routes used by merchants and pilgrims. Brahmanical temples and religious communities also received patronage from rulers and local elites. Inscriptions recording gifts of land, money, wells, caves, or buildings show a world where political authority and religious prestige were closely connected. A king might lose a frontier province. A dynasty might collapse. But a monastery could still receive donations. A sacred site could still attract pilgrims. A town could still support artisans, moneylenders, officials, and traders. Mathura remained a major religious and artistic centre. Cities in the northwest continued to link India with Central Asia, even as the political conditions around them changed. Other urban centres may have shrunk, shifted, or lost importance. That happened. Political fragmentation could damage roads, disrupt tax systems, and make trade more dangerous. But decline in one city was not decline everywhere. This is why we should be careful with the later rise of the Gupta Empire. Looking backward, it is easy to see the Guptas emerge in the 4th century and assume that they were destined to reunify northern India after the Kushans, as if the political disorder of the 3rd century was simply a waiting room for the next great empire. History does not work like that. The Guptas began as one regional dynasty among others. Their later expansion depended on circumstances that were not guaranteed. Successful rulers, military victories, alliances, access to resources, and the weaknesses of rivals. Nothing in 235 AD made a Gupta empire inevitable. What people living through the Kushan decline saw was not the future. They saw local powers rising, old connections adapting, and uncertain frontiers opening new dangers and new opportunities. That is the larger pattern emerging across the ancient world. When an empire weakened, power did not disappear with it. It moved. It broke into pieces. It was claimed by provincial commanders, merchant cities, frontier kings, religious institutions, and ambitious dynasties that had once lived in the shadow of a greater state. The old centre faded, but the world beneath it kept moving. And across the Red Sea, the same thing was happening. Not collapse everywhere, not one African empire falling in sync with Rome, Persia, India, and China. Africa was far too large, too diverse, and too connected by different systems for that kind of simple story. But the balance of power was changing. For Rome, Africa was not a distant edge of the map. It was part of the empire's economic heart. Egypt, conquered by Rome nearly 3 centuries earlier, remained one of the most valuable provinces in the Mediterranean world. The Nile flood supported an enormous agricultural system. Grain from Egyptian fields moved north through Alexandria, across the sea, and toward the great cities of the empire. Rome itself depended on this flow. A bad harvest, a disrupted shipment, a revolt near the river, or a failure of administration could become a political crisis hundreds of miles away. And Egypt was only one part of the system. Across the Mediterranean, Roman North Africa, especially the fertile lands of modern Tunisia and coastal Algeria, produced grain, olives, olive oil, pottery, and other goods consumed across the empire. Vast estates and smaller farms alike fed cities, armies, and markets. Amphorae made in African workshops have been found from Britain to the Black Sea. They carried oil, wine, fish sauce, and other products, through a commercial network so large that it is easy to forget how much depended on ordinary things. Rain falling at the right time, farmers having access to land, ships reaching port, tax collectors doing their jobs, and soldiers keeping roads safe. When Rome entered its crisis after 235, these provinces did not suddenly vanish into chaos. Egypt remained Roman, North Africa remained Roman. Grain ships still sailed, taxes were still collected. Town councils, landowners, merchants, and imperial officials continued their work. In some ways, the African provinces were among the resources that allowed the empire to keep functioning when its frontiers and leadership were under intense pressure. But that did not make them untouched. A government fighting wars on multiple frontiers needed more money, more food, more recruits, more control. Every demand made at the centre travelled outward. Provincial communities felt it through taxation, requisitions, military movements, and the uncertainty created when emperors rose and fell with alarming speed. Still, Roman Africa was not the whole continent. Further south along the Nile beyond Egypt lay the kingdom of Kush, centred on the city of Meroe. Kush had been a major power for centuries. Its rulers controlled territory in Nubia, drew wealth from agriculture along the river, worked iron and maintained trade links reaching north toward Egypt and east toward the Red Sea. The kingdom had once been strong enough to challenge Rome directly. In the late 1st century BC, Kushite forces fought Roman armies in southern Egypt. The conflict ended not in total conquest, but in a negotiated settlement. That alone tells us something important. Rome's southern border was not an empty desert line. It was a frontier between states. By the 3rd century, however, the old Kushite order seems to have been under growing strain. The evidence is incomplete. we do not have a detailed year-by-year history of Meroe's decline. Archaeology, inscriptions, settlement patterns, and later traditions give us fragments, not a complete narrative. But the broad pattern is hard to miss. Kush was losing the position it had once held in the Nile Valley and the Red Sea world. There may have been pressure from neighbouring peoples. Control over trade routes may have shifted. Environmental conditions may have made agriculture more difficult in some areas. Internal political changes may have weakened central authority. Probably no single explanation is enough. That is usually how states decline. Not because one dramatic event destroys everything in a day, but because several pressures arrive before the old system has adapted to any of them. And while Kush was weakening, another power was rising farther east, in the highlands of what is now Ethiopia and Eritrea, Aksum. In 235 AD, Aksum was not yet the famous Christian kingdom of later centuries, with its monumental inscriptions and imperial claims across the Red Sea. But it was already becoming a significant regional state. Its rulers were positioned near routes linking the African interior to the Red Sea coast. They could draw on highland agriculture, control access to valuable goods, and participate in the commerce moving between Africa, Arabia, India, and the Mediterranean. This was not a minor advantage. The Red Sea was one of the great connecting corridors of the ancient world. Ships moved down from Egyptian ports, passed through the narrow waters near Arabia, and entered the Indian Ocean. They carried wine, glassware, metal goods, coin, and manufactured products south and east. In return came pepper, spices, textiles, gemstones, ivory, tortoiseshell, incense, and exotic animals. African ports and inland kingdoms were not isolated spectators in this trade. They supplied goods, hosted merchants, taxed movement, and shaped the security of the routes themselves. Aksum stood where several worlds met. To the north was Roman Egypt. Across the water lay Arabia. Beyond Arabia and the Gulf were Persian-controlled lands and Indian ports. To the south and west lay African trade networks, reaching toward Nubia and the interior. A ruler who could command even part of this intersection possessed something more valuable than a stretch of territory. They possessed leverage. This did not mean Aksum instantly replaced Kush, or that every merchant route simply changed direction overnight. Trade networks are stubborn. They survive political change because too many people benefit from keeping them alive. Merchants find new partners. Ports compete. Local elites adjust. Old capitals shrink while new ones grow. But the shift mattered. As Roman emperors struggled to hold their armies together, as Persian kings pushed west and east, as Kushan authority fragmented across Central Asia and northern India, the Red Sea world was being reorganized too. Rome still had Egypt, Kush still existed, Aksum was still rising. None of these stories match perfectly. That is the point. The ancient world was not collapsing like a building with one foundation. It was changing like a network when its strongest connections begin to weaken and new routes start carrying the weight. And nowhere was that network more dense, more valuable, or more vulnerable than around the Mediterranean. The sea connected Rome's provinces, grain from Egypt and North Africa, olive oil from Spain and Africa, wine from Italy, Gaul and the Aegean, pottery, glass, metalwork, textiles, slaves, livestock, timber, papyrus, spices arriving through Red Sea ports. Goods moved by ship because ships could carry enormous loads more cheaply than carts ever could. A merchant in Carthage could sell oil in Rome. A potter in Africa could find customers in Britain. A soldier on the Rhine might eat bread grown hundreds of miles away. This was not a modern economy. There were no banks directing global investment, no central ministry measuring quarterly growth, no single market price for everything from Syria to Spain. But it was a system, and systems can come under stress long before they visibly break. The crisis after 235 put pressure on almost every part of it. War was expensive. Rome had always spent heavily on its armies, but now emperors were fighting more often against more dangerous enemies, while also fighting one another. A ruler who had seized the throne through military support needed to keep that support. That meant pay, donatives, bonuses handed to soldiers at accession, supplies, weapons, horses, fortifications, food for marching armies, grain for garrisons, money for officers whose loyalty might last only as long as the next payment. And the government did not create those resources from nothing. It took them from the provinces. Taxes could be collected in coin, but increasingly the state demanded goods directly. Grain, oil, animals, cloth, wagons, labour and lodging. This was requisitioning. In theory, it was an emergency measure or a structured obligation. In practice, for a farming village beside an army route, the difference could be hard to see. Imagine you are a farmer in Gaul, the Balkans, Syria or North Africa. You have already paid taxes. Then officials arrive needing grain for troops. Soldiers need animals, transport teams need carts. A frontier campaign has disrupted the roads. Bandits or deserters are moving through the countryside. Your local market still exists, but you have less to sell, and the coins you receive may buy less next season than they bought last season. That is how imperial warfare entered ordinary life. The most visible sign of the problem was money for centuries. Roman coinage had depended on public confidence that silver coins contained meaningful amounts of silver. The system was never perfectly stable. Emperors had altered coin values before. But during the 3rd century, the pressure became severe. The Antoninianus, a coin introduced under Caracalla a generation before 235, was supposed to be worth more than the older denarius. Yet its silver content steadily declined. Under later 3rd century emperors, coins that looked silver could contain only a thin silver wash over mostly base metal. The state could strike more coins from the same amount of precious metal. That solved an immediate problem. Soldiers and suppliers could be paid. But it created another. When people realize that new coins contain less silver than old ones, they begin treating them differently. Prices may rise, older, better coins disappear from circulation because people hoard them. Merchants demand more money for the same goods. Tax collectors may insist on payment in kind or in higher quality currency. A government trying to meet its obligations discovers that every new issue of debased coin can weaken trust in the next one. This is often called inflation, and there was clearly serious monetary disruption in parts of the empire. But we should be careful. A debased coin does not prove that every Roman everywhere became poor overnight. Ancient economies were regional. Many villages produced much of what they consumed. Taxes could be paid in grain or other goods. Local markets often depended more on harvests, labour, land, and personal relationships than on a steady supply of silver currency. In some regions, people may have used coins less, not because commerce vanished, but because other forms of exchange became more important. The archaeological evidence tells a similarly uneven story. Some towns declined, some building projects slowed. Some long-distance trade patterns changed sharply. In frontier zones exposed to invasion and civil war, disruption could be brutal. A burned settlement, an abandoned villa, a hoard of buried coins never recovered. These are real signs of fear and instability. But elsewhere, production continued. North African workshops kept making pottery for export. Egyptian agriculture continued to feed cities and armies. Rural estates remained productive in many provinces. Local craftsmen still worked, markets still met, ships still crossed the sea when weather and security allowed. The Mediterranean economy did not simply switch off in 235. In fact, its resilience is part of what makes the crisis so remarkable. Rome endured because provincial societies kept producing. Farmers planted, merchants adapted, local elites organised tax collection. Harbour workers unloaded grain. Town councils continued to function, even when the emperor's name changed again and again. But resilience had a cost. Every successful harvest made another requisition possible. Every functioning workshop created another taxable asset. Every surviving trade route gave the state another channel through which to draw wealth toward the army. The empire's ability to survive its crisis could deepen the burdens that made the crisis worse. And that pressure fed directly back into politics. An emperor needed money to keep soldiers loyal. To get money, he needed taxes and requisitions. Heavy demands could alienate provincial communities and local elites. Economic disruption reduced the resources available to the state. Reduced resources made armies harder to supply. Unsupplied or unpaid armies became dangerous, and dangerous armies could make or unmake an emperor. It was a vicious circle, not one catastrophe, not one universal economic collapse, but a great imperial machine being forced to spend more, demand more, and promise more than its political system could reliably deliver. But there was another pressure operating beneath all of this, one that no emperor could negotiate with, no army could defeat, and no coinage reform could fully solve: the weather. For an ancient farming society, a bad harvest was never just a bad harvest. It could mean less grain in the market, higher prices in the towns, fewer animals surviving the winter, more debt, more desperate migration, less tax revenue for the government, and less food available for the army, precisely when the army was needed most. So when historians look at the crises of the 3rd century, they naturally ask a dangerous question. Was climate part of the story? The answer is probably yes, but not in the simple way people sometimes imagine. Nobody in 235 AD left us a global weather report. There is no ancient database showing rainfall totals from Gaul, Syria, the Nile Valley, northern China and Central Asia for every year of the century. What we have instead are fragments, natural records that preserve traces of ancient environments, and written records that preserve what people noticed when things went wrong. Tree rings are one source, in places where trees grow one ring each year. A wide ring can suggest favourable growing conditions, while a narrow ring may point to cold, drought, or some other stress. Ice cores drilled from glaciers preserve tiny samples of ancient air, dust, volcanic ash, and chemicals carried into the atmosphere centuries ago. Lake sediments, cave deposits, pollen preserved in mud, even changes in river channels can reveal long-term shifts in rainfall, temperature, vegetation, and erosion. It is extraordinary evidence, a tree growing on a mountainside, a glacier accumulating snow year after year, a lake quietly collecting mud on its floor. All can become archives of a world with no written weather station. But they are not magic. A narrow tree ring does not tell us that a village revolted against Rome. Ash in an ice core does not tell us which emperor lost an army. A drying lake in one region does not prove that the entire old world entered the same drought at the same time. Climate evidence is often regional. It can be difficult to date precisely. And most importantly, human beings do not experience climate as an average. They experience it locally. A cooler decade might shorten growing seasons in one highland region, while bringing useful rainfall somewhere else. A failed monsoon could devastate one agricultural zone, while leaving an irrigated river valley relatively secure. Too little rain could destroy crops. Too much rain could do the same. Floods, late frosts, Unseasonal storms, pests, and shifts in river flow could all turn a normal farming year into a disaster. The 3rd century appears to have included real environmental variability across parts of Eurasia and North Africa. Some regions may have faced episodes of drought, others may have suffered harvest instability or changing rainfall patterns. Written sources from the Roman world sometimes mention famine, failed crops, and extraordinary weather, though ancient authors were not modern climatologists. They often saw disasters as divine warnings, signs of bad rule or proof that the world had become morally disordered. Still, they were describing real fear, and fear mattered. Picture a community already living close to the margin. The state has raised taxes because armies are campaigning, local roads are unsafe, coin values are uncertain. A landlord expects rent. Then the rains fail, or arrive too late, or a flood washes away fields ready for harvest. A rich estate may survive. It has stored grain, labourers, animals, credit, connections with officials, maybe access to several different plots of land in different places. A small farmer may not. One poor season can mean borrowing seed for next year. 2 can mean selling animals. 3 can mean abandoning land, joining a patron's household, moving toward a town, fleeing across a frontier, or entering the army because the army at least promises food. That is how environmental stress becomes political stress. Not because drought somehow causes an emperor to be murdered, but because hunger, displacement, falling revenue and competition for resources make every existing conflict harder to manage. And this is where the idea of one giant climate explanation starts to break down. The Roman Empire, Sasanian Persia, the Kushan world, the kingdoms of India, the states of China, Kush and Aksum did not all have the same geography. They did not grow the same crops. They did not depend on the same rivers, rainfall systems, trade routes, or political institutions. Egypt depended on the Nile. Northern China depended heavily on river systems, seasonal rains, and grain-producing plains, vulnerable to flood and drought. Mesopotamia relied on irrigation networks that required constant maintenance. The Iranian plateau was shaped by aridity, mountain corridors, and carefully managed water. The Mediterranean contained countless local environments, from the grain fields of North Africa to the wetter provinces of Gaul and the mountainous Balkans. The same climatic disturbance could produce completely different outcomes in each place. A drought might be catastrophic where agriculture depended on rainfall, yet less severe where irrigation, grain storage, or long-distance imports could compensate. A flood might wreck one region's harvest but replenish another region's soils. A state with effective local administration could organise relief, move grain, delay taxes, repair canals, or protect transport routes. A state already paralysed by civil war might do none of those things. This is the crucial point. Climate does not act on empty landscapes. It acts on societies. It acts on who owns the grain, who controls the water, who can store food, who has roads, ships, granaries, tax collectors and soldiers. It acts on whether local elites cooperate with the state or see a crisis as their chance to escape it. It acts on whether farmers have somewhere to go when their fields fail. A bad harvest in a stable kingdom is a hardship. A bad harvest in a kingdom already fighting succession wars, frontier invasions, inflation and epidemics can become something much worse. So climate may have been a multiplier of vulnerability. It could deepen shortages, intensify migration, strain tax systems and make armies more expensive to feed. It could turn local disputes into desperate struggles. But it was not a single master cause pulling every empire on 3 continents toward collapse like a hidden string. If the climate was changing, it did not write the outcome in advance. People did, institutions did, geography did. The decisions of emperors, generals, landlords, merchants and communities did. And one more force was waiting in the background, capable of turning hunger and instability into a demographic catastrophe. Disease, and unlike drought or cold, disease can move with the very networks that make an empire rich. A ship carrying grain into Rome can also carry infected passengers. A caravan crossing Mesopotamia can move more than silk, spices, and silver. An army marching from one frontier to another gathers men from dozens of provinces, packs them into forts and camps, then sends survivors home again. Cities concentrate people, animals, waste, and water supplies. Trade routes connect populations that would otherwise remain separated for generations. The ancient world had built an enormous system of connection, and that system had a biological cost. About 70 years before 235, the Roman world had been struck by what later historians call the Antonine Plague. It appears to have begun during the reign of Marcus Aurelius, probably around 165 AD, as Roman armies returned from campaigns in the eastern provinces. It spread through the empire in waves, and seems to have remained a concern, or returned repeatedly, into the 1017s and perhaps beyond. Ancient writers described fever, diarrhea, throat inflammation, skin eruptions, and terrible mortality. The physician Galen, who witnessed part of the outbreak, left the most famous account. But even Galen did not give us the answer modern historians want. He did not identify a virus. He could not test blood samples. He was describing symptoms through the medical ideas of his own age. So what was it? Smallpox is the leading possibility. Measles has also been suggested. Some scholars think the evidence fits one better than the other. Others warn that trying to diagnose an epidemic from almost 2,000-year-old descriptions is like trying to identify a modern disease from a damaged witness statement translated through several languages. The names are uncertain, the scale is uncertain too. You will sometimes hear that the Antonine Plague killed a quarter of the Roman Empire, or a third, or even more. Those numbers are possible in particular places during severe outbreaks. But for the empire as a whole, they are difficult to prove. Rome had no census bureau publishing annual death totals. Cities did not send complete mortality reports to the emperor. Most of the people who died were never recorded in any surviving text. What we have are fragments, a historian noting deaths in an army, an inscription replacing a lost official, a papyrus showing disruption in Egypt. Coinage, taxes, burials, settlement patterns, and scattered references to abandoned land or labour shortages. Each piece tells us something. None gives us a clean, empire-wide body count. But uncertainty does not mean nothing happened. Even a mortality crisis that killed far fewer people than the highest estimates would have mattered enormously. Ancient societies operated close to the edge. Most farms depended on family labour. Most towns depended on regular deliveries of food. Most governments depended on taxes collected from productive households. Most armies depended on a steady supply of young men, animals, grain and cash. Remove people from that system, and every other problem becomes more expensive. A village loses farmers, fewer fields are planted. The harvest shrinks. Tax collectors still arrive because the army still needs pay. Families sell land, borrow money or leave. A town loses craftsmen, merchants, dockworkers and tenants. Markets become thinner. Buildings go unrepaired. Local councils have fewer wealthy men capable of funding public life. An army loses soldiers to sickness, then has to recruit replacements from a population already reduced by death and hardship. And recruitment is not just about numbers. A state can always order more men into service. The question is whether those men are healthy, trained, equipped, and willing. If farms are short of labour, taking more young men into the army can damage food production. If towns are poorer, raising taxes can provoke resistance. If soldiers know that disease has devastated previous units, desertion becomes more tempting. If an emperor needs emergency recruits during a civil war, he may rely on whoever is available: frontier communities, allied tribes, hastily trained volunteers, men whose loyalty belongs more to their commander than to the state. This is how demographic loss can become political instability, not because a plague automatically destroys an empire. Rome had survived epidemics before. It possessed grain fleets, roads, administrative systems, military discipline, and immense reserves of wealth. In some regions, communities may have recovered quickly. In others, losses may have been severe but temporary. The deeper question is whether the Antonine plague left long shadows. Did it reduce population enough to weaken the tax base for decades? Did recurring outbreaks make cities less resilient? Did it make it harder for emperors to replace dead soldiers, maintain frontier garrisons, or collect the revenue needed for wars? Historians disagree on how far to push these arguments. The evidence supports disruption. It does not allow us to treat the plague as a simple explanation for everything that followed. And it is important not to invent a disease event in 235 that the evidence does not show. There was no documented worldwide pandemic beginning exactly when Maximinus Thrax became emperor. No proof that Rome, Persia, India, Central Asia, China, Kush and Aksum all collapsed because one new infection swept across 3 continents in the same year. That is not the story. The story is slower and in some ways more unsettling. The Antonine plague may have exposed the vulnerability of a highly connected imperial world. It may have reduced the margin for error in communities already facing taxes, war, harvest failures, and political uncertainty. It may have made recovery uneven, leaving some regions strong and others depleted. And when later crises arrived, rulers were managing states that may no longer have had the same demographic reserves they once possessed. Then, after 235, the pressure would grow worse. Civil wars did not happen in a vacuum. Every claimant to the throne needed soldiers. Every soldier needed pay. Every campaign consumed grain, horses, weapons, transport, and men who could have been planting crops or repairing roads. If disease had already made people scarcer, then each new war became harder to finance, harder to supply, and harder to survive. A succession crisis in a full, prosperous, healthy empire is dangerous. A succession crisis after decades of disease, disruption, and uneven recovery can become a machine for multiplying losses. And that machine had a price. It had to be paid in coin, in grain, and above all in soldiers. Coin, grain, and soldiers. That was the basic equation of imperial survival. An empire could possess magnificent palaces, ancient traditions, brilliant generals, and borders stretching across continents. But if it could not turn the labour of farmers, merchants, herders, and craftsmen into food for armies and rewards for officials, its power could disappear with shocking speed. Rome understood this better than almost anyone. The Roman state did not collect taxes simply to make the emperor rich. Taxes paid for frontier forts on the Rhine and Danube. They bought grain for troops in Syria and North Africa. They maintained roads, arsenals, ships, administrators, messengers, and the endless paperwork required to govern millions of people across thousands of miles. Some revenue came in coin, some came in kind: wheat, oil, animals, cloth, timber, and labour. Egypt sent grain. North Africa sent grain. Spain produced metals. Provinces paid land taxes, customs duties, inheritance taxes, and taxes on trade. Cities and local elites were expected to fund buildings, festivals, public services, and sometimes military needs from their own wealth. It was an enormous machine, but machines work only when the parts keep moving. A farmer has to plant, a harvest has to arrive, a merchant has to risk travelling. A local council has to assess taxes, a tax collector has to deliver them. A mint has to produce reliable currency, and at the end of that chain, a soldier standing in a cold fort on the Danube has to believe that Rome remembers he exists, because soldiers were not volunteers in some abstract national project. They were professionals. They expected regular pay, food, equipment, medical care, retirement benefits, and often land or cash when their service ended. Their loyalty was personal, practical, and expensive. If an emperor delivered those things, he could ask men to hold a frontier through winter, march against Persia, or fight a civil war hundreds of miles from home. If he failed, the army started looking for someone else. This was one of the central dangers after 235. The murder of Severus Alexander had shown that an emperor who lost military confidence could be removed by his own troops. Maximinus Thrax rose because soldiers believed he could lead them and reward them. But that created a terrible precedent. The army was no longer just the instrument used by rulers to govern the empire. It was becoming a political force capable of choosing rulers, abandoning them or killing them. And every new emperor had to pay the price of that choice. A commander proclaimed by his troops needed money immediately. He needed a donative, a special bonus proving that his reign would be profitable to support. He needed supplies for the men who had made him emperor. He needed more recruits because rival claimants would soon raise armies of their own. He needed to secure the frontiers while fighting Romans against Romans. So taxes rose. Property was assessed more aggressively. Local communities faced heavier demands. Wealthy elites who had once competed for civic honour found themselves pressed into office because office carried financial obligations. Landowners could be required to provide animals, wagons, grain, lodging and labour for passing troops. Merchants faced customs duties and requisitions. Villages that had already struggled through disease, poor harvests or labour shortages now had to feed armies moving through their districts. And when ordinary taxation was not enough, rulers had other options. They could confiscate property from political enemies. They could demand compulsory purchases at prices set by the government. They could borrow, they could seize temple wealth. Or they could make more money. Literally, Roman coinage had long depended on confidence. A silver coin was not valuable only because of the metal inside it. It was valuable because people trusted that the emperor's stamp meant something. It meant the coin would be accepted for taxes, trade, rents, and military pay. But during crisis, emperors repeatedly reduced the precious metal content of their coins. The silver denarius, once a relatively dependable currency, became increasingly diluted. By the middle of the 3rd century, many coins that looked silver contained only a thin surface wash over cheaper metal. At first, this could help. A government with limited bullion could strike more coins, pay more soldiers, and meet an emergency. But the emergency did not vanish. Prices could rise. People could demand payment in gold, goods, or older, more trusted coin. Suppliers charging the army for grain, horses, armour, and transport began protecting themselves against a currency losing value. The state responded by demanding still more taxes and supplies. That is the loop. War requires money. Money raised under pressure weakens confidence. Weak confidence makes supplies more expensive. Expensive supplies require heavier extraction. Heavier extraction damages farms, towns, and trade. A weaker economy produces less revenue, and less revenue makes the next war even more dangerous. Civil war turned this pressure into a furnace. When 2 emperors fought, neither could wait patiently for next year's taxes. Both had to reward soldiers now, both had to promise promotion, bonuses, land and plunder. Both marched through Roman provinces, treating them less like communities to protect and more like reservoirs of food, animals, cash and recruits. The winner inherited an empire exhausted by the struggle. The loser left behind unpaid troops, angry taxpayers and officials whose loyalty had become uncertain. A governor who had supported the wrong claimant might fear execution. A frontier army that had not received its bonus might proclaim a new commander. A city punished for backing a rival might conclude that imperial protection was no longer worth its cost. Legitimacy began to break down. Not everywhere, not all at once. Rome still possessed extraordinary resources. Its tax system continued functioning. Its armies still won battles. Its cities remained active. Even amid crisis, emperors built, minted, legislated, and governed. But the balance was changing. The same broad problem appeared beyond Rome, though never in exactly the same form. The Sasanian kings of Persia needed revenue to support cavalry, fortresses, royal courts, and campaigns against Rome. Their power depended heavily on land, tribute, control of irrigation, and the wealth of Mesopotamian trade routes. A successful king such as Shapur I could turn military victory into prestige and tribute. But war on Rome's frontier was costly for Persia too. Horses ate. Armies required grain. Garrisons had to be supplied across difficult terrain. In China, the Han collapse and the Age of the Three Kingdoms had made the fiscal problem brutally visible. Competing regimes needed grain taxes, registered households, transport networks, and men for permanent armies. Control of fertile land and population registers could matter as much as battlefield victory. A ruler who lost productive farmland or saw peasants flee could lose the ability to feed troops, no matter how grand his title sounded. Across Central Asia and the former Kushan world, fragmentation altered the flow of tribute and trade. Smaller rulers could still profit from oasis cities, caravan tolls, fertile valleys, and strategic passes. But they had fewer reserves when routes shifted, rivals attacked, or local elites stopped cooperating. In India, rising regional powers faced their own versions of the same challenge, turning agricultural surplus and commercial wealth into stable political authority without exhausting the communities that produced it. This was not one synchronized financial collapse. Rome's coinage crisis was not identical to China's struggle for registered taxpayers. Persian royal revenues did not operate like Roman provincial taxation. Kushan fragmentation did not mean every city became poor or every trade route failed. But across 3 continents, states were discovering the same hard truth. Empire was expensive. The larger the army, the more it cost. The more frontiers threatened, the more soldiers rulers needed. The more civil wars erupted, the more rewards those soldiers expected. And the harder governments squeezed their populations, the more people had reason to evade taxes, flee the land, support local strongmen, or place their hopes in a different ruler. Money did not cause every collapse, but without money, grain, and loyal soldiers, no empire could survive long enough to solve its other problems. And as states struggled to pay for power, people themselves began to move. And as states struggled to pay for power, people themselves began to move. Some moved because armies forced them from their homes. Some moved because taxes, debt, drought, or disease made staying impossible. Some moved because a frontier that had once been dangerous suddenly offered land, wages, markets, or the protection of a stronger ruler. And some had always moved. This matters because ancient history often tells the story of migration in the simplest possible way. Civilized empire here, barbarian invaders there. Then one day, people beyond the border pour in, and everything falls apart. But that is not what the 3rd century world looked like. The people on Rome's Rhine and Danube frontiers were not an anonymous mass waiting outside civilization. They were farmers, herders, traders, craftsmen, mercenaries, aristocrats, prisoners, diplomats, and political refugees. Many had traded with Rome for generations. Some served in Roman armies. Some lived inside imperial territory. Some had relatives on both sides of the border. Names like the Alemanni, Franks, Goths, and Carpi do not describe single united nations marching under one flag. They describe shifting confederations. Groups could join together under a successful war leader, split apart after defeat, absorb newcomers, or change their names entirely. A Roman official might call them one people because that made the map easier to understand. The reality on the ground was much messier and much more connected. A frontier was not a wall between two separate worlds. It was a zone of contact. Goods crossed it, information crossed it. So did fugitives, captives, soldiers, merchants, missionaries, spies, and envoys, carrying gifts from one ruler to another. Rome needed these relationships. The empire recruited men from frontier communities. It traded wine, metalwork, coins, ceramics, and luxury goods beyond its borders. Roman merchants wanted hides, livestock, amber, slaves, and raw materials. Roman commanders sometimes paid subsidies to influential leaders, hoping to keep one group peaceful or persuade it to fight another. That could work, but it could also create a dangerous kind of dependency. Once a leader had gained wealth and prestige through Roman payments, his followers expected him to keep delivering. If Rome was distracted by civil war, if the subsidies stopped, or if a rival leader promised richer plunder, the frontier relationship could turn violent very quickly. So when Germanic groups crossed a river, raided a province, or pressed against a weakened garrison, this was not always an invasion in the modern sense. It could be a response to opportunity. It could be a struggle for access to trade and land. It could be a political crisis within the Confederation itself. Or it could be a chain reaction caused by pressures far beyond Rome's immediate horizon. The same pattern appeared across Eurasia. The Sasanian Empire did not simply face Rome to the west. Its rulers had to manage the Caucasus, Mesopotamia, the Persian Gulf, eastern Iran, and the approaches to Central Asia. They dealt with Arab groups along desert margins, Caucasian kingdoms in mountain corridors, and mobile peoples moving through the open country beyond the Iranian plateau. Sometimes negotiation was cheaper than war. A king could recognize a local ruler, exchange gifts, arrange marriages, recruit cavalry, or turn a frontier community into a buffer against a more dangerous rival. But buffers are never completely under control. A mobile group could protect a frontier one year and raid it the next. A local ruler could accept Persian support while quietly negotiating with Rome. A caravan route could enrich an oasis city, making it worth defending, then become a target the moment imperial authority weakened. Central Asia made all of this even more complicated. This was the corridor between empires. Not empty space between Rome, Persia, India, and China, but a vast network of grasslands, mountain passes, river valleys, and oasis cities. Sogdian merchants, pastoralist communities, local kings, Buddhist travelers, Iranian-speaking nobles and soldiers from many backgrounds moved through it. When the Kushan political order fragmented, movement did not stop. In some ways it became more important. Smaller states competed for customs duties, caravan traffic, fertile valleys, and strategic roads. A merchant might find new opportunities under a local dynasty. A displaced warrior might enter another ruler's service. A city that lost one imperial patron could seek protection from another. Instability could redirect wealth as much as destroy it. China offers another version of the same story. After the Han collapse, War displaced enormous numbers of people. Families fled devastated districts. Farmers moved toward areas controlled by stronger armies. Local elites carried dependents, records, grain, and military followers into new territories. Rival states needed those people desperately, because households meant taxes, labour, and recruits. And China's rulers also negotiated with mobile frontier groups, including Xianbei, Wuhuan, Qiang, and others whose relationships with Chinese states had never been simply hostile. They traded horses, they served as allies, they fought as enemies. They settled within imperial territory. Chinese warlords recruited them, tried to control them, and sometimes found that the forces they had invited in had become political powers in their own right. This is the key. Movement was not just a symptom of collapse. It was one of the mechanisms through which power moved. A migrating community could bring military pressure to a frontier. But it could also bring new cavalry skills, new trade connections, new crops, new languages, and new religious ideas. Refugees could strain a city's food supply while also supplying labour and knowledge. Armies could devastate a province, then carry its coin, weapons, engineers, and political ambitions into the next region. Did crisis in one part of Eurasia directly push people into another in the year 235? Sometimes the evidence is too thin to say. We should be careful. There was no single human wave sweeping across 3 continents and knocking over every empire in its path. But there were connected corridors, and when war, taxation, disease, or political failure destabilized one region, people and resources did not remain politely in place. They looked for another road, and that raises the larger question. If Rome, Persia, Central Asia, China, India, and Africa were all facing different crises at roughly the same time, were those crises truly separate? Or were they parts of a wider world beginning to fracture along its most important connections? The answer is yes, but not in the simple way we might want. It is tempting to imagine one hidden catastrophe moving across the map. A plague beginning in the east, spreading west along the Silk Roads, emptying cities, breaking armies, and bringing down every empire in its path. Or a climate shift causing drought from China to Rome. Or a massive migration chain, one people pushing another until the whole of Eurasia began to move. Ancient history has room for dramatic chain reactions, but the evidence for one single trigger in 235 is not there. To connect these crises properly, we have to ask a harder question. What could actually carry pressure from one region to another? Trade is the obvious place to start. By the 3rd century, Afro-Eurasia was tied together by commercial networks of astonishing reach. Roman glassware and Mediterranean goods reached the Indian Ocean. Indian spices, gems, textiles, and ivory moved toward the Red Sea and Persian Gulf. Silk from China passed through Central Asian merchants and Iranian intermediaries before reaching wealthy customers in the Roman world. But trade routes moved more than luxury goods. They moved information. A merchant arriving in an oasis city could bring news of a new Persian king, a civil war in Rome, banditry on a mountain pass, or shortages in a distant market. They moved silver, military equipment, religious ideas, skilled craftsmen, and diplomatic gifts. And potentially, they moved disease. That possibility matters. The Antonine plague had already shown how vulnerable the Roman Empire was to epidemic disease. Later outbreaks, including the plague of Cyprian in the middle of the 3rd century, struck during Rome's political and military crisis. Disease could reduce tax revenue, empty farms, weaken recruits, and make every other problem harder to solve. But we need to be precise. A disease outbreak in Rome does not prove that an epidemic had begun in China. Similar symptoms in ancient texts do not automatically describe the same pathogen. and because disease leaves limited traces in the archaeological record, it is often easier to imagine a pandemic than to demonstrate one. The same caution applies to climate. There were real environmental pressures in this period. Rainfall patterns changed. Some regions faced harvest failures. Drought could weaken pasture lands, reduce food supplies, increase conflict, and encourage migration. A run of bad harvests did not have to destroy an empire by itself. It only had to arrive when rulers were already short of money, soldiers, and political legitimacy. But climate was never one uniform force acting identically across 3 continents. A dry phase could hurt one region while another benefited from different rainfall. A failed harvest in North Africa had different consequences from one in the Yellow River Basin, the Iranian Plateau, or the Gangetic Plain. Environmental stress created risks. It did not dictate a single outcome. And then there is war. This may be the strongest connection of all, not because every conflict was coordinated, but because empires were linked through the cost of defending themselves. Rome's struggle with Persia tied down troops and money in the east. Persian rulers had to think about Rome, but also Central Asian frontiers and internal rivals. Central Asian political fragmentation changed the balance around the Kushan world. Chinese successor states spent enormous resources fighting each other while negotiating with recruiting and resisting frontier peoples. War created movement. Movement created new military pressures. And military pressure made states spend more, tax more, recruit more, and take bigger risks. That is a real web of interconnection. But a web is not the same thing as a machine. Chronology is the test that keeps us honest. The Han Dynasty had fallen in 220, 15 years before the murder of Severus Alexander at Mainz. The Parthian Empire was overthrown around 224, when the Sasanians replaced it. Those were not consequences of Rome's crisis in 235. They were already established transformations with their own histories. The Kushan world too did not collapse on one universally agreed date. Its political authority appears to have fragmented unevenly across regions, with local powers rising at different times. In India, this did not create an empty space. It created a patchwork of regional states. And in northeast Africa, Aksum was not simply collapsing alongside Rome and Kush. It was emerging as a more important power in Red Sea trade. The dates do not line up neatly because history did not happen neatly. The strongest evidence for connection is found in the corridors between these worlds. The caravan routes, sea lanes, mountain passes, frontiers and border markets where goods, people, pathogens and military intelligence moved. A disruption in one place could raise prices somewhere else, redirect merchants, displace soldiers, or open an opportunity for a rival ruler. But the strongest evidence for local causes is just as important. Rome's crisis grew from assassinations, civil war, military overextension, monetary strain, and the impossible politics of an army that could make and unmake emperors. Persia's transformation came from an ambitious new dynasty, overthrowing a weakened Parthian order. China's fragmentation followed decades of rebellion, court conflict, warlordism, and the collapse of Han authority. Central Asia's changes reflected the vulnerability of a corridor built on contested routes and shifting local alliances. These crises could affect one another. They could intensify one another. They could create opportunities across enormous distances, but they were not copies of the same event. Afro-Eurasia was interconnected. It was not yet a single synchronized system, where one shock instantly produced the same result everywhere. It was a world of powerful states, regional ecologies, local ambitions, and long-distance connections. When one part fractured, the tremors could travel far. But every empire broke along its own fault lines, and that is the real meaning of 235 AD. Not the day every empire on 3 continents suddenly collapsed. Not the beginning of one universal apocalypse triggered by one plague, one drought, one migration, or one hidden disaster that swept from China to Rome. It was a turning point. A moment when the fractures already running through the ancient world became impossible to ignore. At Mainz, the murder of Severus Alexander showed that Rome had lost something essential, the ability to manage the transfer of power without violence. The empire did not vanish in 235. Rome still had cities, armies, roads, laws, tax collectors, grain ships, and enormous resources. It would survive for centuries, but the old imperial balance had broken. Over the next 50 years, emperors would rise and fall with terrifying speed. Armies would proclaim their own commanders, frontiers would come under pressure. Currency would lose value, provinces would be raided, invaded, and in some cases temporarily separated from the central government. Rome was not dead, but it was changing under extreme pressure, becoming a more militarized, more centralized, more defensive empire. Further east, Persia was not collapsing at all. The Sasanians had replaced the Parthians only a decade earlier, around 224 AD. That was a revolution in the structure of power, not a simple disappearance of Iranian civilization. The new dynasty was more ambitious, more centralized in its image of kingship, and more willing to confront Rome directly. Shapur I would soon lead Persian armies into Roman territory, capture cities, defeat emperors, and demonstrate that Rome no longer faced the divided frontier politics of the old Parthian world. For Persia, this was not the end of empire. It was the beginning of a new one. The Kushan world tells a different story again. Across Central Asia and northwestern India, the great Kushan political order appears to have fragmented unevenly. Some territories fell under pressure from Sasanian expansion. Others came under local rulers, regional dynasties, or successor powers whose histories are harder to recover. Coins change, royal names disappear, authority becomes less visible across long distances. But fragmentation is not the same thing as silence. Trade did not simply stop. Cities did not all empty. Oases remained occupied. Merchants still crossed mountain passes when conditions allowed. Religious communities continued to move ideas, texts and artistic styles between India, Central Asia and China. The Kushan Empire may have lost its old coherence, but the world it helped connect remained alive. And in India, the result was not a void. There was no single giant empire replacing the Kushans across the subcontinent. Instead, regional powers expanded, competed, made alliances, and built their own political centres. This can look like collapse if we only measure history by the size of empires. But for people living in those regions, it could also mean new courts, new patrons, new trade routes, and new opportunities. A map with more borders is not always a map of less life. China had already gone through its own imperial break before 235. The Han dynasty fell in 220 after decades of rebellion, court intrigue, military strongmen, and civil war. The Three Kingdoms period that followed was brutal. It consumed lives, harvests, and resources on a massive scale. But it was also an age of adaptation. Wei, Shu, and Wu were not random gangs fighting in the ruins. They were organized states with administrations, armies, taxation systems, engineers, diplomats, and ambitious rulers trying to reunify the old Han world on their own terms. China had fragmented politically, but it had not ceased to be a complex civilization. In fact, the institutions and cultural traditions of the Han continued to shape every successor state that claimed its inheritance. And Africa complicates the story even further. Roman North Africa remained vital to the empire, producing grain that helped feed Italian cities. Egypt was still one of Rome's richest provinces. The kingdom of Kush continued along the Nile, though under pressures and changes of its own. And across the Red Sea, Aksum was growing in importance. Aksum did not enter the 3rd century as the victim of a continent-wide collapse. It emerged through trade, agriculture, military power, and access to the Red Sea world. As older powers struggled or shifted, new powers found room to rise. That is what makes this period so difficult to reduce to one simple narrative. Some states fell, some fractured, some reorganized, some expanded. The ancient world was not a row of dominoes. It was more like a field of dry ground crossed by hidden cracks. Pressure in one place could widen a fracture somewhere else. A war could redirect trade. A disrupted caravan route could weaken a border city. A disease outbreak could make a tax crisis worse. A drought could push pastoral groups toward a frontier already defended by an underpaid army. Connections mattered, they were real, but they carried pressure unevenly. Rome's crisis was Roman in its origins, even if Persian wars, disease, and trade disruption made it worse. The Sasanian rise was Iranian, rooted in the overthrow of Parthian rule and the ambitions of a new dynasty. China's division grew out of the long unravelling of the Han state. The Kushan successor regions reflected the changing politics of Central Asia, India, and the Iranian frontier. Aksum's rise shows that the same connected world that brought danger could also create opportunity. So, was there a larger crisis across Afro-Eurasia? Maybe. But not one that can be reduced to a single date, a single cause, or a single story. The better question is not, what destroyed every empire at once? It is this: how much pressure could travel through an ancient world that was connected by ships, horses, merchants, armies, pilgrims, refugees, and rumours? We still do not have a complete answer. The sources are uneven, the archaeology is incomplete, and every new coin, hoard, inscription, pollen sample, shipwreck, or ancient DNA study can change the picture. But 235 AD remains powerful because it lets us see the world in motion. An emperor is murdered on the Rhine. A new Persian dynasty is rising in the east. China is divided among rival kingdoms. Central Asian routes are being renegotiated by new powers. India is becoming more regionally diverse. Across the Red Sea, Aksum is gaining strength. Nobody living in one of those places could see the entire map. But they were part of the same map, and that may be the deepest lesson of this strange year. Ancient societies were more interconnected than the old stories of isolated empires suggest. Yet they were also more resilient than the story of one total collapse allows. When imperial structures broke, people did not simply disappear. They adapted. They traded through new routes. They served new rulers. They rebuilt cities, moved communities, and created political worlds their grandparents would barely recognize. If this changed the way you see the ancient world, please like the video, subscribe, and leave a comment. And tell us where you're listening from. The best way to support the channel is to listen on Spotify, with the link in the description. Because history is never just the story of what falls. It is also the story of what survives the fall, what grows through the cracks, and what connects distant people long before anyone realizes they were living through the same age of change.